Hello there and welcome back. If you're getting comfortable, if the lamps are low, if the world has gone quiet around you, good. Settle in, because tonight's story is one of those that asks for patience and for stillness and for the willingness to follow a single life across nearly 7 decades of difficulty, danger, and slow, improbable triumph. Tonight we are going to a palace at Greenwich, on the Thames, in September of 1533. The autumn is well advanced. The air is cool over the river. The court of King Henry VIII has been gathered for weeks, waiting. The king himself has waited for a quarter of a century. He has waited through one marriage of nearly 20 years, through the slow erosion of his hopes for a male heir from his first wife, through the protracted and bitter break with the Roman Catholic Church, through the remaking of English religion, through the elevation of his second wife from a courtier's daughter to a crowned queen. He has waited, in particular, for the child his second wife is now about to deliver. He has been told by his astrologers and by his physicians and by his confidants that this child will be the son he has needed. The labour begins on the 3rd of September. It continues with the alarms and the prayers and the quiet, busy movement of midwives and physicians and ladies in waiting into the morning of the 7th. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon of that day, a Sunday, a child is born. The child is alive and healthy. The child is also, to the disappointment of almost everyone in the palace, a girl. The records of the next several hours, where they survive, give a picture of a court adjusting itself to news that nobody had wanted. The proclamation that had been prepared, announcing the birth of a prince, has to be rewritten. The heralds, who had been ready to ride out across England with the news of an heir, are held back while new wording is found. The king himself, by all accounts, takes the disappointment with a public composure that is more an effort of will than a spontaneous reaction. He visits his wife. He calls the child healthy. He orders the celebrations that custom requires. But the great Te Deum that had been planned for the cathedrals of England is quietly cancelled. The bonfires and the conduits running with wine, which would have marked the birth of a son, are reduced to a smaller and more subdued observance. The infant girl is, from her first hours, the cause of a national disappointment that her existence cannot quite undo. She is named, 3 days later, at her christening at the Friars' Church at Greenwich. The ceremony is elaborate. The child's godparents include the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who had recently presided over her parents' marriage, and the Dowager Marchioness of Dorset and the Duchess of Norfolk. She is wrapped in a robe of purple velvet, with a long train of ermine. The procession through the palace is led by gentlemen carrying the gilt basins and the silver gilt cup that her godparents have brought as gifts. She is given the name Elizabeth, after both her grandmothers. The ceremony proceeds correctly, and with the proper dignity, and at its end the heralds finally proclaim, before the assembled congregation, the titles of the new princess. This is the child whose story we will follow tonight, from her unwanted birth through the death of her mother 3 years later, through the long, uncertain years of her childhood, through the dangers and humiliations of her adolescence under her brother and her sister, through the imprisonment and the interrogations of her early adulthood, through the unlikely accession and the long, careful reign that gave her name to an age, to her death at Richmond Palace in the early hours of a March morning in 1603. After 44 years on a throne, nobody had expected her to occupy. We are going to walk through that life slowly, not because the events themselves require slowness, but because a life of this scale, with its turning points and its long quiet stretches and its gradual accumulation of consequence, deserves to be experienced at the pace at which it was lived. She is one of the most studied figures in English history, The libraries of the world contain shelves and shelves of books about her, scholarly and popular and everything in between. She has been the subject of plays and films and television series for 400 years. The phrase Elizabethine, attached to a period of English literature and to a style of architecture and to a quality of nationalist mythology, has shaped the way the English-speaking world has understood its own past. She has become, in cultural terms, almost too large for any single biographical account to contain her. The myth has overgrown the woman. Tonight, we are going to try to recover the woman, not the virgin queen of the late portraits, encrusted with pearls and surrounded by symbols, not the Gloriana of Spenser's poem, not the good Queen Bess of patriotic schoolbooks. The actual person, the girl who was told when she was 2 years old that she was no longer a princess, the teenager who was interrogated by the Privy Council and gave answers that older men remembered for the rest of their lives, the young woman who survived 2 months in the Tower and walked out of it, not knowing whether she would ever walk free again. The new queen, 25 years old, who inherited a country in religious crisis and held it together with a settlement that none of her advisers fully approved of, the middle-aged woman who signed the death warrant of her cousin and could not eat or sleep for days afterwards, the old queen who lived long enough to see her own legend take shape around her and who did not always recognize the figure she had become. The story is long. It deserves to be long. So get comfortable, because we are going back now to that autumn afternoon at Greenwich Palace in 1533, and we are going to follow the child who was born there against all expectation and against all calculation into the life she lived. Let us begin where she began. With the unwanted daughter in a court that had wanted a son, the first 3 years of her life were, in many respects, the safest she would know for some time. She was given her own household, as was the custom for royal children, at the manor of Hatfield in Hertfordshire, 20 miles north of London. The household was substantial. There was a lady mistress in charge of her care, a position held first by Lady Margaret Bryan, a relative of her mother, and a woman who had served the royal nursery for years. There were nurses, there were rockers, women whose specific duty was to rock the infant in her cradle. There were chamber women and laundresses, and gentlemen of the Privy Chamber and a chaplain. The household for an infant princess of England in 1533 numbered perhaps 30 or 40 individuals. They were paid out of the royal treasury, fed at the royal expense, and dressed in the royal livery, and their entire daily existence was organised around the care and the dignity of one small child. She was, in those early months, a healthy infant. She walked early. She spoke early. The reports that reached her parents from Lady Bryan and the other members of the household consistently described a bright, alert, forward child. Her parents visited her when they could. Anne Boleyn, in particular, took the kind of close interest in her daughter's clothing and her education and her development that the records of the period make clear. There survive several letters from Anne to Lady Bryan, fussing about the child's caps, asking after her progress, sending small gifts. Anne was, by every account that has come down to us, a present and concerned mother, in the manner that the period allowed mothers to be present and concerned, which was at a careful distance and through correspondence rather than through daily contact. The political ground, however, was already shifting. Anne Boleyn had ascended to the throne against the wishes of half the country. Her marriage had required the king to break with Rome. Her elevation had required the demotion and humiliation of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and the declaration of his first daughter, Mary, as illegitimate. Mary was now 17 years old. The same age difference between her and her infant half-sister as there was between most fully grown adults and their younger siblings. She was bitter, defiant, and unwilling to accept the new arrangements. She was kept under a kind of house arrest in various royal manors, at one point being forced to share a household with the infant Elizabeth, an arrangement designed to humiliate her by requiring her to defer to the new princess. Anne's hold on the king depended, more than on anything else, on her producing a son. She had not yet done so. Her first pregnancy after Elizabeth, in 1534, ended in some kind of loss, the precise nature of which the records do not establish. There was, possibly, a stillbirth in 1534. There may have been further pregnancies in 1535 that did not come to term. By the early months of 1536, the political situation was deteriorating rapidly. Anne had enemies who had been waiting since her elevation to bring her down, and the absence of the promised son was giving them the opportunity they needed. In January 1536, Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, died. The political effect was immediate. With Catherine dead, the question of whether Henry's first marriage had been legitimate became, in some sense, less urgent. The argument that Anne had displaced a wronged woman lost some of its force. The king was, technically and undeniably, a widower from his first marriage. He could now, if he chose, end his second marriage without the political complication of having to take Catherine back. The conditions for Anne's removal had been created. In the same month, Anne miscarried what would have been a son. The grief and the fear in her household must have been considerable. Her husband, who had been distancing himself from her for some time, now drew further away. He had begun to pay attention to one of her ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, a quiet, pale young woman from a family that had been positioning itself, with patient ambition, for exactly such an opening. What followed between January and May of 1536 was a political destruction so swift and so complete that it has continued to fascinate historians for nearly 500 years. Anne was arrested at the end of April. She was charged with adultery with several men of the court, with incest with her brother George, and with conspiring the king's death. The charges were, by any reasonable historical assessment, false or at minimum unprovable on the evidence presented. The trial was conducted at the Tower of London. The men accused with her were tried first and convicted. Anne herself was tried by a commission of peers that included her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. She was executed on Tower Green on the morning of the 19th of May, 1536. The execution was carried out by a swordsman brought specially from Calais, a courtesy of sorts to the Queen, who had requested it. Her last words, given before the small crowd of witnesses, were brief and conventional. She praised the king as a kind and gentle prince. She asked the watchers to pray for her. She submitted herself to the law. The blow was struck. The body was placed in an arrow chest, because no proper coffin had been prepared, and was buried that afternoon in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the precincts of the tower itself. The infant princess at Hatfield was, on the day of her mother's execution, 2 years and 8 months old. The records do not preserve any account of how the news was conveyed to her, or what was said, or what she understood. She would not have understood much. She was a small child in a country household, and the events of the Tower of London were happening 40 miles away in a world she had never seen. But the consequences of those events reached her household within days. On the day after Anne's execution, Henry was formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. They were married 11 days later. Within weeks, The Act of Succession was modified by Parliament. Elizabeth, like her older half-sister Mary before her, was declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. She lost the title of princess. She became, in the formal language of the new statute, simply the Lady Elizabeth. The household at Hatfield struggled, in the immediate aftermath, to know how to respond. The funds that had supported Elizabeth's establishment as a princess had been generous. The funds that supported a demoted, illegitimate daughter were considerably less generous. There survives a famous letter from Lady Bryan, written in the summer of 1536, addressed to Thomas Cromwell, the King's chief minister. The letter is one of the most poignant documents of the entire reign. Lady Bryan wrote that she did not know what to do. The child, she said, had no clothes that fitted her. She had outgrown her gowns and her petticoats and her caps. Lady Bryan asked, with the careful diplomacy of a household servant addressing power, whether the king's pleasure was that new clothes should be provided, and if so, of what sort, since the rank of the child was now uncertain, and Lady Bryan did not wish to clothe her improperly. The letter is small. It is domestic. It is in its way more devastating than any account of the political events at court. A 2-year-old child whose mother had been executed weeks earlier was outgrowing her clothes, and her household was waiting for instructions on what to do about it. Cromwell, who was in many ways a careful administrator, eventually saw to it that the practical arrangements for the child were made. New clothes were provided. The household was maintained, although at a reduced level. Lady Bryan continued in her care. Elizabeth was moved between several royal manors in the years that followed, depending on which were available and which were preferred by the council that managed her affairs. She lived through the rest of her childhood in a peculiar twilight position. She was the king's acknowledged daughter in the practical sense that she was provided for by his treasury. She was not, in legal terms, his heir. She was an awkward fact, a half-acknowledged figure, a child whose existence did not fit easily into any of the formal categories that the Tudor court understood. The houses she occupied in the years following her mother's death included Hatfield, Hunsdon, Eltham, Hertford, Ashridge, and others. Each was a substantial royal property in its own right, with its own household staff and its own established daily rhythms. The child was moved between them at intervals, partly for reasons of public health, since the periodic outbreaks of plague required royal households to abandon properties that had become unsafe, and partly for reasons of administrative convenience, as the various properties were prepared for use by other members of the family, or by the king himself. The pattern of her early life was one of constant displacement. She had no fixed home. She had no settled rooms. She had no familiar windows looking out on the same view from one year to the next. The household, with its furniture and its silver and its books, was packed into wagons and carried to a new property, where it was unpacked and arranged in the same configuration that it had occupied in the previous house. The ladies and the servants and the small girl all moved together, like a kind of travelling royal court in miniature, occupying a series of properties without belonging to any of them. What did she remember of her mother? The historical record does not allow us to answer with any confidence. She was old enough, by the time of Anne's death, to retain some impressions, though probably not full memories. As an adult, she rarely spoke of her mother. The references that do survive are guarded. She kept throughout her adult life a small ring that contained, when it was opened after her death, 2 miniature portraits, one of herself and one of Anne Boleyn. The ring suggests something. The silence around it suggests something else. The truth of what she felt about the woman who had given birth to her and been killed when she was still very young is, like much in her interior life, beyond our reach. What we can say is that the events of 1536 set the pattern for a particular feature of her temperament that would become, in later years, one of the defining qualities of her rule. She had learned, before she could fully understand what she was learning, that political position was not stable, that the highest favour could be withdrawn, that the people closest to power were sometimes the most vulnerable, and that survival required a kind of attentiveness that most children were not asked to develop. She would carry these lessons forward into every year of her subsequent life. They would, in time, save her several times over. There is, in the records of these years, a kind of quiet that contemporary documents do not always note, but that the historian, looking back, cannot help but observe. The little girl in her panelled chamber at Hatfield or Hunsdon or Eltham was not the centre of any household's anxious attention in the way that her infant existence had once been. The country had moved on. Her father had a new wife, then another, then another. Her father had a new son, the long-awaited Edward, born in October 1537 to Jane Seymour, who died of complications within days of the birth. The royal succession, in the year after Anne Boleyn's execution, had been transformed by the arrival of a male heir. Elizabeth, in her demoted, illegitimate position, became, in the political calculations of the period, a figure of diminished interest. She was not at the centre of any plot. She was not the subject of any major diplomatic correspondence. She was simply a small girl in a country household, growing up in a series of palaces, attended by servants who did their duty by her, without any expectation that her future would be remarkable. She would in later years recall this period of her life with very little detail. The years between her mother's death and her father's death are, in her own subsequent references and in the surviving letters and accounts, a kind of muted background to the more dramatic events that would follow. She had been, for those 9 years, simply a child. The political world, having no particular use for her, had let her alone. The years that followed her mother's death were, for Elizabeth, primarily the years of her education, and her education, by any reasonable historical standard, was extraordinary. She received, from the late 1530s through the late 1540s, a course of instruction that was the equal of what was offered to the most carefully educated young men of her generation. She was the beneficiary of a particular moment in English intellectual history, when the new humanist learning that had been spreading from Italy across Europe for nearly a century had finally taken firm root in England, and when the leading practitioners of that learning were available to be employed in the service of the royal household. The decision to give her this kind of education was not, in itself, an obvious one. She was an illegitimate daughter, removed from the succession, with no clear political future. The investment in her schooling reflected, in part, the general humanist enthusiasm of her father's later court, in part, the influence of her stepmothers, particularly Catherine Parr, in part, the desire of her father, in his ambivalent way, to provide for a child whose existence he had not entirely cancelled even when he had legally repudiated it. The education proceeded, year after year, in conditions that made its eventual quality almost a kind of accident. The girl who emerged from that education was, by the end of her teens, one of the most learned women in Europe. She was also, in retrospect, one of the most learned monarchs of her century, a fact that would prove consequential when, against all expectation, she finally became one. Her first significant tutor was William Grindal, a young scholar from Cambridge who had studied under the great humanist Roger Ascham. Grindal began to instruct her in Latin and Greek when she was about 10. in 1543 or 1544. He was a careful, methodical teacher. The progress reports he wrote on his pupil were enthusiastic. She was, he said, not just a willing student, but a brilliant one. She had a memory that retained almost everything she encountered. She had a feeling for the classical languages that suggested a real intellectual gift. She worked hard. She wanted to please her tutor, and she wanted to master what was put in front of her. The schoolroom in which this work took place was a quiet panelled chamber, in whichever royal manor the household happened to be occupying at the time. There was a desk. There were the texts in their heavy vellum-bound editions that any scholar of the period would have recognized. There were the writing materials, the ink and the quills and the sheets of paper for the daily exercises. The morning was the time for the most demanding work, when the mind was fresh. The classical languages were the principal subjects. The afternoon was given to the modern languages and to the lighter accomplishments of music, dance, and embroidery, although Elizabeth, in her own preferences, would have continued reading Greek into the afternoon if her tutors had let her. When Grindal died of plague in 1548, Roger Ascham himself took over her instruction. Ascham was, at this point, one of the most distinguished classical scholars in England. He had been a Fellow of St. John's College, Cambridge. He had written, in 1545, a treatise on archery called Toxophilus, which had been the first serious work of English prose on a non-religious subject, and which had attracted favourable attention in court circles. He was a careful, slightly pedantic, deeply devoted teacher. The relationship he developed with his royal pupil was one of the great intellectual friendships of the Tudor period. Under Ascham's instruction, which continued until 1550 and resumed in occasional consultation for years afterwards, Elizabeth read deeply in the Greek and Latin classics. She read Cicero in Latin and translated him into English. She read the New Testament in Greek. She read Sophocles. She read substantial portions of Demosthenes. She studied Roman history through Livy and Sallust. She studied moral philosophy through Aristotle. She translated, on her own initiative or at her tutor's suggestion, various passages between the languages in both directions, which Ascham then critiqued. The standard exercises of humanist education were performed at a level that, even by the standards of the most accomplished young scholars of the day, was considered remarkable. The texts she read in these years would, in some cases, have a direct bearing on the political education that she could not yet have known she was receiving. Cicero's speeches and letters, which Ascham had her read carefully, were the foundational texts of the Western tradition of political eloquence. Their lessons about the management of public opinion, about the art of speaking to multiple audiences at once, about the careful construction of an ethos that would make even controversial positions acceptable, were lessons that she would draw upon decades later in her own speeches to Parliament and in her addresses to her people. Livy's history of early Rome offered models of statecraft and of political crisis that would be relevant, in modified form, to her own circumstances. Plutarch's Lives, which she also read, gave her examples of the lives of statesmen and rulers that she would carry with her into the practical political work of her later years. The humanist education was not, in its ostensible content, a political education, but it produced in its careful student a political mind of unusual depth. Beyond Latin and Greek, she learned French and Italian, both of which she spoke fluently as an adult, conducting much of her diplomatic correspondence in those languages and, on occasion, holding meetings with foreign ambassadors in their own tongues without the assistance of an interpreter. She learned some Spanish, She received as a young woman the standard instruction in music and dancing and embroidery that any noblewoman of her generation would have received, and she was good at all of these as well, though they were not where her real interest lay. But predictably, what stands out in the surviving evidence about her education is the seriousness of her engagement. She was not learning Latin because it was expected of a young noblewoman. She was learning it because she found the work intellectually compelling, and because she had decided, at some point in her early teens, that she was going to become a person of genuine learning. Ascham, in a famous passage in his later treatise, The Schoolmaster, written long after his pupil had become queen, recalled the long mornings of reading in her chamber. He said that she had read more Greek with him than most clergymen had read in Latin. He said she had a mind like polished steel, sharp and bright, and capable of cutting through any text put in front of her. The praise was the kind a tutor offers a former pupil who has gone on to greatness, and it should be discounted accordingly. But the underlying picture of a serious, bookish young woman who had read more deeply than her station required is consistent with everything else we know about her in the period. She also produced, in these years, certain pieces of original work that have survived. At the age of 11, in 1544, she translated, as a New Year's gift for her stepmother Catherine Parr, a French religious poem by Margaret of Navarre called The Mirror of the Sinful Soul. The translation, which was made into a small leather-bound volume in her own handwriting, with embroidered covers worked by her own hand, survives in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. The translation itself is competent for an 11-year-old, although not extraordinary. The volume as a whole, with its careful penmanship and its hand-stitched binding, is one of the most touching surviving artifacts of any Tudor childhood. Young Elizabeth had wanted to please her stepmother, and she had laboured at every aspect of the gift, from the translation to the calligraphy to the needlework, with the careful attentiveness that would characterise her serious engagements for the rest of her life. She made the following year a similar gift for her father, translating Catherine Parr's own devotional work, Prayers and Meditations, into Latin, French, and Italian. The trilingual translation, again presented as a New Year's gift, again survives. Her father, who took less notice of her than her stepmother had, accepted the gift with the formal courtesy that the occasion required, and apparently set it aside without further comment. The young girl, eager for paternal attention that she rarely received, had performed an extraordinary feat of scholarship that the recipient had been unable to recognize. The pattern was, in some respects, characteristic of her relationship with her father, and the small disappointment was one of many similar small disappointments that made up her experience of him. Her companion in much of this learning was her younger half-brother Edward, Henry's son by Jane Seymour, who had been born in October 1537 and who survived when Jane herself did not. Edward was, like his half-sister, exceptionally well educated. He was instructed by some of the same tutors. He read the same texts. The siblings, who saw each other irregularly at court and through correspondence, developed a relationship that was probably the closest of Elizabeth's youth. Edward called her his sweet sister Temperance, a nickname that suggested the studious, careful, somewhat austere quality that he saw in her. Their letters to each other, which survive in some quantity, are full of references to their reading and their progress and the small affectionate details that siblings exchange. Beyond Edward, the most important figure in Elizabeth's adolescence was her stepmother, Catherine Parr. Henry had married Catherine in 1543, When Elizabeth was 9, Catherine was the king's 6th and last wife. She had been twice widowed before her marriage to the king. She was clever, well-read, devoutly Protestant in her religious sympathies, and personally kind to her stepchildren in ways that the king's previous queens had not always been. She brought all 3 of his children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, into closer relationship with each other and with the royal court. She supported their educations. She advocated for them with their father, who had grown ill and irritable in his last years. Catherine's own life and writings would later become important to Elizabeth's intellectual development. Catherine had become, by the mid-1540s, one of the most accomplished women writers in England, producing devotional works in English prose that drew on the new continental Protestant theology and that pressed the boundaries of what an aristocratic woman could publish under her own name. Her book Lamentation of a Sinner, published in 1547 shortly after the king's death, was an explicitly Protestant devotional work that aligned her, openly, with the Reformist Party. The book had a substantial influence on the religious atmosphere of Edward's court in its early years. Elizabeth, who had grown up in Catherine's household at intervals throughout the early 1540s, and who continued to live in it after the king's death, was directly exposed to this kind of articulate female religious authorship. The example of a queen who wrote and published in her own right would have been for the adolescent Elizabeth the most direct model of intellectual female accomplishment that her culture could have offered. Elizabeth came to live in Catherine's household for substantial periods during the 1540s, particularly after Henry's death in January 1547. The household was an intellectual one. Catherine wrote her own devotional works, 2 of which were published in the 1540s. She corresponded with leading reformist clergymen. She encouraged the conversation, at her dinner table, of theological and humanistic topics that in the first decades of the Tudor age would not have been thought appropriate for women to discuss. Elizabeth, in her early teens, was exposed in Catherine's household to a kind of educated female intellectual life that left a permanent impression. She would, throughout her own subsequent life, value books and learning and the company of educated people in ways that the Tudor court did not always reward. The death of her father in January 1547 changed everything for Elizabeth. She was 13. Edward, her brother, was 9, and was now king. Mary, her elder half-sister, was 31, and was now first in line to the throne after Edward, despite her continuing technical illegitimacy under the laws her father had enacted, since the late king had restored both his daughters to the line of succession in his final years, even while leaving their illegitimacy formally in place. Elizabeth herself was second in line, behind Mary. The country was about to be governed, in Edward's name, and during his minority, by a council of regency dominated by the boy king's uncles, the brothers of his mother Jane Seymour. The senior of these brothers, Edward Seymour, would become Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset. The younger Thomas Seymour would become Lord High Admiral and would, through actions of his own, become the central figure in the most dangerous episode of Elizabeth's adolescence. Thomas Seymour was a handsome, charming, ambitious, and deeply reckless man. He was, by every contemporary account, the kind of figure whom many women found compelling and whom most experienced courtiers thought a fool. He had wanted, in the months after Henry's death, to marry one of the king's daughters, either Mary or Elizabeth, as a way of cementing his own position near the centre of power. The council had refused to entertain the suggestion. Marriage to a princess of the blood, without the council's formal approval, would have been, under the laws then in force, an act of treason. Seymour, frustrated in this ambition, had turned instead to the Dowager Queen, Catherine Parr, whom he had courted before her marriage to Henry, and who had, by some accounts, loved him at that time. Within a few months of Henry's death, Seymour and Catherine were secretly married. The marriage was discovered by the council and reluctantly accepted. Seymour moved into Catherine's household at Chelsea. Elizabeth, who was living with Catherine, found herself sharing a household with her new step-uncle. What happened next was, by any reasonable account, troubling. Seymour, in the months that followed, began to behave towards the 14-year-old Elizabeth in ways that the period registered as inappropriate, and that would, in our own time, be recognised as something considerably more serious. He came into her bedchamber in the early mornings before she was dressed. He engaged in horseplay with her, pretending to chase her around her room, slapping her familiarly. On one occasion, in a garden, in the presence of his wife, he reportedly held the girl while Catherine cut her dress to ribbons with shears. The incidents accumulated. The household servants noticed. Elizabeth's governess, Cat Ashley, who had been her closest attendant since childhood, and who would remain so for many years, became increasingly concerned and spoke to Catherine about it. What Catherine knew, what she did not know, what she may have suspected, the historical record does not allow us to establish with full clarity. By the spring of 1548, Catherine was pregnant. By May, she had decided that Elizabeth must leave the household. The departure was managed without overt scandal. Elizabeth was sent to live with the household of Sir Anthony Denny and his wife, who were friends of Catherine's, at their manor at Cheshunt. The transfer was framed as a routine arrangement. The reasons were not, at the time, made public. Catherine gave birth to a daughter, Mary Seymour, in August 1548. She died of childbed fever 6 days later, on the 5th of September. She was 36 years old. The daughter, who was named after the Princess Mary, would herself die in infancy not long afterwards. Thomas Seymour, freed by his wife's death, now revived his earlier ambitions. He began to plot, with the recklessness that had characterized his entire career, a marriage to Elizabeth. He used intermediaries to communicate with her household. He sent gifts. He made suggestions through Cat Ashley that he was interested in seeking the council's permission to marry her. Cat Ashley, who appears to have been genuinely fond of Seymour and to have thought the marriage might be a good one for her young charge, encouraged the correspondence in ways that were, in the political climate of the period, profoundly unwise. By December 1548, Seymour had moved beyond mere talk of marriage. He had begun to consider, with the conspirators he was gathering around him, a more direct attempt at power. The exact nature of his plans is difficult to reconstruct. He may have been planning to seize the person of his nephew the king and govern through him. He may have been planning to marry Elizabeth and use her as a route to the throne. He may have been simply talking, in the way ambitious, unstable men sometimes talk, without any coherent design. Whatever the precise content of his intentions, he was acting in ways that the council could not ignore. In January 1549, Thomas Seymour was arrested for treason. The charges against him included 33 articles accusing him of conspiring against his brother, of plotting to seize the king, and of conspiring to marry Elizabeth without the council's permission, which was in itself treason. He was committed to the Tower. The investigation that followed turned, almost immediately, towards Elizabeth's household. Cat Ashley was arrested. Thomas Parry, the cofferer of Elizabeth's household, was arrested. Both were taken to the Tower and questioned about Elizabeth's relationship with Seymour, and about any plans for marriage that might have been under discussion. Both, under prolonged questioning, eventually gave statements describing the various incidents of the previous year, the horseplay, the morning visits, the discussions of marriage. The statements were brought to the council. The council sent its chief interrogator, Sir Robert Tyrwhitt, to Hatfield, where Elizabeth was now living, to interrogate her directly. Elizabeth was 15. She was being questioned by an experienced political interrogator on charges that, if proved against her, could end her life. Her two closest attendants were already in the Tower. Her admiral, the husband of her stepmother, was about to be executed. The political situation around her was as dangerous as any she would face for the next 40 years. What followed was, in retrospect, one of the most striking performances of her young life. Tyrwhitt interrogated her over the course of several days. He used every technique available to a Tudor interrogator. He told her, falsely or with selective truth, what others had already confessed. He suggested that she should make a clean breast of everything before her servants implicated her further. He pressed her on the specifics of the gifts, the conversations, the alleged marriage discussions. He framed his questions in ways designed to elicit incriminating answers. She gave him almost nothing. She acknowledged with carefully chosen language what she could not deny. She acknowledged that Seymour had visited her household. She acknowledged that there had been at some point talk of marriage, but said that any such talk had been understood to depend on the council's approval, which she had always known would be required. She refused to incriminate herself, refused to incriminate Cat Ashley or Parry beyond what was absolutely necessary, and refused to provide any information that would support the more serious charges against Seymour. Tyrwhitt wrote in his dispatches to the council that he had never encountered a more difficult subject for interrogation. She was, he said, more able to defend herself by her wit than any man he had ever questioned. He requested that the council send a more skillful interrogator. He noted, with the slightly puzzled professional respect of a man who had been outmatched, that she would not be trapped. The interrogation continued, in various forms, over several weeks. Eventually the council concluded that there was no evidence sufficient to charge her with treason. The investigation closed. Cat Ashley was eventually released, after some months in the Tower. Parry was released. Elizabeth herself remained at her own household, under closer supervision than before, but at liberty. Thomas Seymour was tried by attainder, rather than by ordinary trial, which meant that the Parliament condemned him directly without the requirement of a formal jury verdict. He was executed on Tower Hill on the 20th of March 1549. He had been, in his last weeks, a man whose unsteadiness of mind had become increasingly apparent. He went to his death with a combination of bravado and confused defiance that the witnesses found disturbing. Elizabeth, when she heard the news of his execution, is reported to have said, with the controlled formality that was already characteristic of her, "This day died a man with much wit and very little judgment." The phrasing has been quoted often. It captures something true about Seymour, and about the young woman who could already, at 15, formulate a public response to the death of a man who had been, in some confused way, important to her. The lessons of this episode were profound. She had come close, by her own later reckoning, to losing everything. She had been compromised, in the eyes of the council, by association with a man who was now considered a traitor. She had been forced to defend herself against questioning that could have led, with one wrong answer, to her own arrest. She had seen her closest attendants taken from her and held in the Tower. She had been forced to recognise, in a way that no 15-year-old should have to recognise, that her name and her position made her a target for any unstable man who saw in her a route to power, and that she would have to learn, for the rest of her life, to manage that fact. Her response, in the years that followed, was a withdrawal into a particular form of self-presentation that she would maintain for the rest of her brother's reign. She became, in public, a serious, modest, devoutly Protestant young scholar. She dressed plainly. She avoided court except when summoned. She continued her studies. She was careful in her correspondence to express only the most conventional sentiments. She gave her brother's counsel no further opportunity to think of her as a political problem. The years from 1549 to 1553 were, in this sense, the quietest of her life. She lived primarily at her household at Hatfield. She read and studied. She corresponded with her brother. She visited court when it was politic to do so, and otherwise stayed away. She had learned from the Seymour affair that visibility was dangerous, and she practiced invisibility with a discipline that almost no other young woman of her position could have matched. Her household at Hatfield, which she had been granted by her father in his will, was a substantial establishment, although smaller and more modest than the household she had occupied as an infant princess. She had her own servants. She had her own chapel. She managed her affairs with care, with Thomas Parry as her principal financial officer, and with Cat Ashley, restored to her service after her release from the Tower, as her chief gentlewoman. The household was, in its quiet way, a kind of training in administration. The young woman who would 10 years later take charge of the affairs of an entire kingdom was, in the early 1550s, learning the smaller scale of household management that was the only practical experience available to her. Edward's reign was throughout these years a period of intense religious change. The young king, advised by a succession of Protestant councillors, presided over the systematic dismantling of the older Catholic forms that his father had left in place, and the establishment of a more thoroughly Protestant religious settlement. The Book of Common Prayer was issued in 1549 and revised, more radically in 1552. The Mass, in its old form, was abolished. The altars were replaced with communion tables. The images and the candles and the incense were removed. The English Reformation, which under Henry had been a political break with Rome rather than a doctrinal transformation, became under Edward a doctrinal transformation in earnest. Elizabeth, who had been raised in the household of Catherine Parr, and who was, in her own beliefs, sympathetic to the reformist position, presented herself as a model Protestant princess throughout this period. She read Protestant theological works. She corresponded with Protestant clergymen. Her household followed the new prayer book strictly. She was, in the eyes of the reforming council, a credit to the new arrangements. The contrast with her older sister Mary, who refused to give up the Latin Mass, and whose household continued to celebrate Catholic services in defiance of the new laws, was sharp. By 1552, Mary's intransigence had become a major political problem for the council. Elizabeth, who said little and conformed entirely, was no problem at all. She visited her brother at court on occasion, although her visits were less frequent than she would have wished. The relationship between them, which had been close in their shared childhoods, was constrained by the formality of their respective positions and by the political watchfulness that surrounded the young king's household. They wrote to each other when she was not present. The letters that survive show a mutual affection that in the cold political climate of the period was one of the few warm relationships in either of their lives. But Edward, throughout these years, was sickly. He had been a healthy child in his early years, but from the age of about 12 he had begun to suffer from a series of illnesses that the medicine of the period could not adequately diagnose or treat. By the spring of 1553, when he was 15, his condition had deteriorated to the point that his survival was openly doubted. He was coughing blood. He was wasting. His doctors, who had at first hoped for recovery, began, during the early months of 1553, to prepare for the possibility that he would not see his 16th birthday. The succession question now became urgent. Under his father's will and under the Act of Succession of 1544, if Edward died without children, the throne would pass to his half-sister Mary, and after her, to Elizabeth. Mary was a Catholic. She would, the reforming council had every reason to believe, undo everything that had been done over the previous 6 years. She would restore the Mass. She would dismiss the reforming clergyman. She would, in all probability, take the country back into the Roman obedience. The leading counsellor of the king's last years, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who had succeeded Edward Seymour as the dominant figure on the council, decided in the spring of 1553 that this could not be permitted. He persuaded the dying king, who shared his religious convictions and who had become increasingly dependent on Northumberland's guidance, to alter the succession by his own will. The mechanism was legally questionable. The king's power to alter a succession set by parliamentary statute was disputed, but the will was drafted. Both Mary and Elizabeth were excluded on the grounds of their continuing illegitimacy. The crown was settled upon Lady Jane Grey, the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, who was 16 years old, devoutly Protestant, and, conveniently for Northumberland, recently married to his own son. Edward died on the 6th of July 1553. The death was kept secret for several days while Northumberland tried to secure the persons of Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom needed to be detained if the new arrangement was to take effect. Mary, who had been warned in time, fled into Norfolk and began to gather supporters. Elizabeth, who was at Hatfield, declared herself ill and refused to travel to court, a tactical illness that allowed her to wait and see how events would resolve. Northumberland's plan failed almost immediately. Mary's claim, despite her Catholicism, was widely accepted by the country. She was the daughter of Henry VIII. She had been first in line to the throne under his settled arrangements. The exclusion of her in favour of an unknown teenage cousin struck most observers as exactly what it was: a transparent political manoeuvre by a faction that had been governing in the dying king's name and that wished to retain power. Within 9 days, Mary's supporters were in the ascendant. Lady Jane Grey, who had been queen for that brief period, and who had not particularly wanted the position, was deposed. Northumberland was arrested. Mary entered London in triumph at the start of August. Elizabeth, who had remained carefully neutral throughout the crisis, now rode into London beside her sister. She was 19. She was, for the first time in her life, in the public position of a princess who might, if her sister died childless, become queen herself. The crowds cheered both sisters together. The early days of the new reign had a quality of reconciliation that, in retrospect, would not last very long. Mary was 37. She had spent most of her life in difficult circumstances, demoted from princess to bastard. separated from her mother, kept in subordinate households, exposed to a long series of religious and political pressures. She had emerged from these years with her Catholic faith intact and with a determination to use the power she now possessed to restore the religion of her childhood. Her early policies were, in this respect, exactly what Northumberland had feared. She began, almost at once, to undo the religious legislation of her brother's reign. The Mass was restored. The married clergy were ordered to put aside their wives or lose their livings. The reforming bishops were arrested. The Protestant settlement that Edward and his councillors had built over 6 years was, within the space of a few months, in active reversal. Elizabeth's position in this new world was difficult. She had presented herself, throughout her brother's reign, as a serious Protestant. Her household had followed the new prayer book. She had been in religious terms on the opposite side of the question from her sister. Now her sister was queen, and Catholicism was once again the religion of the state. Elizabeth had to make a choice. She could refuse to conform, in which case she would be arrested, as her sister had been arrested under Edward. She could conform, in which case she would have to give up the religious identity she had built for herself over several years. She conformed. She attended Catholic services. She made, with what enthusiasm she could manage, the public gestures of religious obedience that her sister required. The conformity was, in the eyes of those who knew her, plainly tactical. Mary herself doubted its sincerity. She wrote to her ambassadors that her sister attended Mass with too plain a face to convince anyone of her devotion. The relationship between the sisters, which had begun the reign in apparent goodwill, deteriorated through the autumn of 1553 and the winter that followed. Then came the marriage. Mary, at 37, was unmarried. She had decided, almost immediately after her accession, that she would marry. The candidate she chose was Philip of Spain, the son and heir of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the most powerful Catholic monarch of his generation. The marriage would, in Mary's view, anchor England firmly to the Catholic cause and to the great Habsburg power that dominated continental Europe. The marriage would also, she hoped, produce an heir who would settle the succession on a Catholic line and prevent the throne from passing, on her death, to her Protestant sister. The proposed marriage was deeply unpopular in England. Philip was a foreigner. He was also, in the eyes of many English observers, the heir to a power whose interests were not necessarily aligned with England's. The marriage treaty, which was negotiated in early 1554, attempted to limit the king consort's role in English government, but the limitations were not enough to satisfy the marriage's many opponents. In January 1554, a rebellion broke out in Kent under the leadership of Sir Thomas Wyatt, a gentleman from a respected family, who declared that he was rising against the marriage and against the foreign domination it would bring. The rebellion gathered support. It marched on London. For several days, the question of whether Mary's reign would survive was genuinely open. The rebellion was eventually defeated. Wyatt was captured and, after some weeks of imprisonment and interrogation, executed. The investigation that followed turned predictably towards Elizabeth. The rebels had, at various points, mentioned her name as a potential alternative monarch. Whether she had been complicit in any active sense, or whether she had merely been a name invoked by men acting without her knowledge, the council could not establish conclusively, but the suspicion was sufficient. In March 1554, Elizabeth was summoned to court for questioning. She was 20. What followed was the most dangerous episode of her life so far. She was interrogated by senior councillors. She was held under guard at the palace. Then, on the 17th of March, she was informed that she was being committed to the Tower of London. The journey was made by barge from Whitehall, downriver in the morning, with the arrangements made hastily so that the palace gates were not yet thronged with onlookers when she left. The barge approached the tower at the Watergate, which was the entrance through which prisoners had been brought to the fortress for centuries, and which had acquired, by the 16th century, the sinister name of Traitor's Gate. Elizabeth, when the barge reached the steps, refused to disembark. She sat on the wet stones in the rain. She declared that she was no traitor. She refused to enter the tower as if she were. The captain of the guard and her own attendants pleaded with her. She remained where she was. After some time, soaked through and exhausted, she finally agreed to enter, but only on the explicit understanding that her entry was not an admission of guilt. She spent 2 months in the tower. She was lodged in the royal apartments, the same apartments that her mother had occupied during her brief time there, nearly 20 years earlier. The historical irony was not lost on her. Her attendants, who had been allowed to accompany her, watched her closely for signs of breakdown. None came. She maintained, throughout her imprisonment, a composure that the Tower's officials found remarkable. She was questioned again several times by various members of the council. She was confronted with statements made by other prisoners. She refused, as she had refused in the Seymour affair 5 years earlier, to incriminate herself or to provide the council with the evidence it needed for a treason charge. The conditions of her imprisonment, while better than those endured by ordinary prisoners, were nonetheless restrictive. She was confined to her chambers for most of each day. She was permitted, after some weeks, to walk along a particular stretch of the wall between the Bell Tower and the Beauchamp Tower, in what came to be called Elizabeth's Walk in later memory. The walk was conducted under guard. She was not permitted to communicate with other prisoners. She was not permitted to receive visitors except those approved by the council. She read what she was given. She prayed. She wrote, on occasion, to her sister, in carefully worded letters that protested her innocence and asked for the Queen's mercy. The replies, when they came, were curt or absent. The most dangerous moment of her imprisonment came in the days immediately after Wyatt's execution. Wyatt, on the scaffold, had spoken some final words about the rebellion in which he had been the principal leader. The exact content of his speech, and whether he implicated Elizabeth or exonerated her, became a matter of intense political dispute. The first report said one thing. Subsequent reports said another. The truth, which historians have continued to debate, was probably that Wyatt had refused to incriminate Elizabeth in his final speech, having recognized that the rebellion's failure had already cost the lives of many of his supporters, and that he saw no purpose in adding hers to the list. Whatever the precise content of his words, they did not provide the council with the explicit accusation against the princess that some had hoped for. The legal case against her, which had always been weak in evidence even where it was strong in suspicion, became weaker still after Wyatt's death. It was in early May 1554, with the council unable to construct a treason case sufficient to justify formal charges, that the decision was finally taken to release her from the Tower into a different form of confinement. She was transferred, on the 19th of May, to house arrest at Woodstock, an old royal manor in Oxfordshire, in the keeping of Sir Henry Bedingfield, a Catholic gentleman whom Mary trusted. The date of her transfer, as several biographers have noted, was the 18th anniversary, almost to the day of her mother's execution at the Tower, in 1536, whether the coincidence was deliberate on the council's part, or whether it was an accident produced by the ordinary administrative timetables of a Tudor government, the historical record does not allow us to determine. She remained at Woodstock for nearly a year. The conditions were limited. She could not freely receive visitors. She was permitted to walk in the gardens, but not to go beyond them. The house itself was in poor repair, with several of its principal rooms uninhabitable, and her suite was small and uncomfortable. She read, she prayed, in the forms that the religious settlement now required. She waited. It was during these months at Woodstock that she is said to have scratched, with a diamond, on a window pane, the famous lines, "Much suspected by me, nothing proved can be," quoth Elizabeth, prisoner. The story of the inscription has been passed down for centuries, and the window pane itself was, for some time, exhibited as a relic. The authenticity of the inscription cannot be definitively established, but the sentiment captures exactly the position she had been forced to occupy. She was suspected of disloyalty by her sister and her sister's council. Nothing had been proven, because there was nothing to prove. She was a prisoner because of who she was, not because of what she had done. Bedingfield, her keeper, was a careful and somewhat anxious man, whose principal concern was that he should not be blamed for any incident that occurred during his charge. He wrote to the council with extraordinary frequency, asking for instructions on minor questions that any more confident official would have settled himself. Elizabeth, who recognized his anxieties and who used them when she could, would on occasion request small variations in her routine that Bedingfield would feel obliged to refer to the council, producing delays and irritations that were in their way a form of resistance. The relationship between the captive and the keeper was correct, formal, mutually frustrating, and never warm. Bedingfield, on her eventual accession, lost his position immediately and was never restored to favour, although the Queen, in her usual style, did him no specific harm and allowed him to retire to his estates without further punishment. Mary's reign, meanwhile, was not going well. The marriage to Philip of Spain had been completed in July 1554, with great ceremony at Winchester Cathedral. Philip had taken up his role as king consort with formal courtesy, but it was clear to almost every observer that he had little personal interest in his English wife, and considerable strategic interest in the wider Habsburg projects in which his marriage was an instrument rather than a purpose. The hoped-for heir did not appear. Mary had, in the autumn of 1554, what was at first announced as a pregnancy. Throughout the winter and into the spring of 1555, the court awaited the royal birth. The expected date came and passed. Further dates were given and passed. By the summer of 1555, it was clear that there was no child, and probably had never been one. The phantom pregnancy, as it has come to be called, was a public humiliation that the Queen and her household could not entirely conceal. The medical understanding of the period could not explain what had happened. Mary herself had felt the symptoms of pregnancy. She had felt movement. She had observed the physical changes that pregnancy produces, but no child had appeared and no labour had begun. Modern medical opinion, looking back through the surviving accounts, has suggested various explanations. She may have had a tumour or growth that produced the appearance of pregnancy. She may have had a hormonal condition that produced the symptoms without the underlying physiological reality. She may have been suffering from a psychological condition, sometimes called pseudocyesis, in which the desire for pregnancy produces, in the body, a partial physiological mimicry of the actual condition. The historical record does not allow a definitive diagnosis, but the public effect was clear. The Queen, who had staked so much of her political position on the production of a Catholic heir, had been visibly unable to produce one, and her authority was diminished in subtle but cumulative ways by the failure. The religious policy of the reign, meanwhile, had hardened. From early 1555, Mary's government had begun the systematic prosecution of leading Protestants who had refused to conform to the restored Catholicism. The first burnings took place in February 1555. The bishops Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, who had been leading figures of the Edwardian Reformation, were burned at Oxford in October of the same year. The Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who had presided over Elizabeth's christening, and who had been a central architect of the English Reformation under Henry and Edward, was burned at Oxford in March 1556. The persecutions continued in waves through the rest of the reign, eventually consuming nearly 300 Protestants who chose death rather than conformity. The historical record of these years is one of the most painful in English church history. The men and women who were burned were, in most cases, ordinary people of conviction who could have saved themselves by recanting and who chose not to. The process was conducted in public. The accounts that survive, particularly those collected later by John Foxe in his Acts and Monuments, often known as the Book of Martyrs, became foundational documents of English Protestantism for the next several centuries. Foxe's book was first published, in its full English version, in 1563, 5 years into Elizabeth's reign. It was placed by official order in every cathedral church in the country. It was read in the parishes alongside the Bible. It shaped more than perhaps any other single document the way the English Protestant tradition understood its own origins, with the burnings of Mary's reign serving as the foundational martyrdoms that gave the new church its claim to authentic religious witness. The cumulative effect on English public opinion was, even within Mary's lifetime, considerable. The Queen, who had begun her reign with widespread popular support, found herself, by 1557 and 1558, increasingly isolated, increasingly criticised, increasingly seen as cruel by a population that had not expected the restoration of Catholicism to take this form. The combination of the burnings, the unpopular Spanish marriage, the loss of Calais in 1558 to French forces, and the visible inability of the Queen to produce an heir, had produced, by the last year of her reign, a level of discontent that the country had not seen in any previous Tudor reign. Elizabeth throughout this period watched and waited. She had been released from house arrest at Woodstock in 1555 after nearly a year, and had been allowed to return to her own household at Hatfield. She continued to attend Catholic services, conform outwardly, and avoid any public statement on the religious question. She received visitors only with caution. She corresponded only carefully. Her position remained delicate. She was the heir presumptive to a queen who did not trust her, who had several times considered having her removed permanently, and who had consistently been dissuaded from such drastic action only by the absence of conclusive evidence and by the political difficulty of executing the heir. In the summer of 1558, Mary believed herself pregnant for a second time. Once again, the pregnancy turned out not to exist. By the autumn, the Queen was visibly ill. Her physicians began to use the language of resignation rather than of recovery. Her husband, who had been absent in the Netherlands for most of the previous 2 years, did not return. In November 1558, Mary, in her last weeks, finally and reluctantly accepted what her ministers had been pressing on her for months. She acknowledged Elizabeth as her successor. She sent her final counsellors to Hatfield to confirm the arrangement. The Queen herself died on the morning of the 17th of November 1558. She was 42 years old. Elizabeth was at Hatfield when the news arrived. The story, which has been told and retold by biographers for 4 centuries, is that she was sitting under an oak tree in the park when her counsellors approached her with the news of her sister's death and her own accession. She is reported to have fallen to her knees and said, in Latin, the verse from Psalm 118, "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes." Whether the scene happened exactly as recorded is impossible to determine. The story was first written down years later, but something like it is consistent with what we know of her temperament, with her habit of reaching for biblical phrasing in moments of significance, and with the carefully constructed self-presentation that she had practiced by then for a decade. Within hours of the news reaching her, the principal courtiers and counsellors of the dying regime began to arrive at Hatfield to make their submissions to the new queen. They came through the November afternoon and into the evening in a steady procession of carriages and riders. Some had served Mary loyally throughout her reign and had every reason to fear the change of regime. Others had been quietly preparing for months or years for the arrival of this day. All of them, regardless of their previous loyalties, now arrived at Hatfield to perform the public gestures of submission that the new political situation required. She received them in the great hall of the manor, in the gathering darkness of a November evening, with candles being lit by her servants as the daylight failed. She had changed her clothes, since the morning, into the more formal dress appropriate to her new position, although she had not yet had access to any of the royal wardrobe and was wearing only what had been available in her own household. She heard the petitions and the professions of loyalty that the courtiers offered. She made the appropriate replies. She announced, before the evening was over, the most important of her early appointments, which was the appointment of William Cecil as her Secretary of State. She was 25. She was, at last, Queen, the girl who had been declared illegitimate at 2 years old, who had been interrogated at 15, who had been imprisoned in the Tower at 20, who had spent 5 years under house arrest and constant suspicion, was now the ruler of England. The question of whether she would be a good ruler, or a successful one, or one who survived for any length of time, remained entirely open. The country she inherited was, in the autumn of 1558, in a difficult condition. The treasury was nearly empty. The previous reign had been expensive, and Mary had borrowed heavily on the international markets to finance her share in her husband's continental wars, including the war against France that had ended in January 1558 with the loss of Calais, the last English possession on the continent. The currency had been debased over the previous 2 reigns, and was by this point in such poor condition that international merchants discounted English coins as a matter of course. The military forces of the country had not been reformed in any serious way since the wars of Henry VIII, and were in their organisation and their equipment behind those of the major continental powers. The religious situation was, if anything, more difficult than the financial one. The country had, in the space of a single generation, been led by its monarchs through 3 major religious changes. Henry's break with Rome had not been a doctrinal reformation, but it had introduced the principle of royal supremacy and had separated the English Church from papal authority. Edward's reign had been a Protestant Reformation in earnest, with the prayer book, the reformed services, the abolition of the Mass. Mary's reign had been a Catholic restoration, with the return of papal authority, the reinstatement of the Mass, and the persecution of those who refused to conform. Each of these changes had been imposed from above, with parliamentary backing but without anything like a popular consensus. The country, by 1558, contained substantial populations of conviction on both sides of the religious question, along with much larger populations who simply wished, at this point, that the religious changes would stop and that some form of stable arrangement could be put in place. What that arrangement should be, however, was not at all clear. Elizabeth's first act, on receiving the news of her sister's death, was to summon her closest adviser. The man she summoned was William Cecil. He was 38, a Cambridge-educated lawyer and administrator, who had served in the household of the Duke of Somerset under Edward, and had managed, with considerable skill, to remain useful to successive regimes without compromising himself fatally on any of them. He had been corresponding with Elizabeth carefully for several years. She had decided, some time before her accession, that he was the man she wanted as her chief minister. When Cecil arrived at Hatfield, she gave him the appointment in terms that would prove over the next 40 years to be exactly accurate. She told him that she gave him this charge because she knew he would not be corrupted by any gift, and that he would give her, without favour or fear, his honest opinion. She added that, whatever opinion she shared with him, he was to keep it secret. The appointment, in this brief exchange, established the working relationship that would dominate the next 4 decades of English history. Cecil would serve her as Secretary of State, and later as Lord Treasurer, until his death in 1598. He would be, throughout that period, her closest and most trusted adviser. Their partnership, beginning at Hatfield in November 1558, was the political foundation of her reign. The new Queen entered London on the 23rd of November. She was met outside the city by a procession of councillors, peers, and London officials. She rode through the city gates, through streets that had been hung with cloth and decorated with the symbols of the new reign. The crowds were large and enthusiastic. The country had, on the whole, been waiting for this. Mary's reign had become widely unpopular. The accession of a young queen, whatever her religious views might prove to be, was greeted with the kind of public hopefulness that royal successions in difficult times sometimes produce. The coronation followed in January 1559. The ceremony was conducted at Westminster Abbey, with the careful protocols of medieval English coronation, modified slightly to suit the religious uncertainties of the moment. The bishop chosen to officiate was the Bishop of Carlisle, since most of the senior bishops of England were now in resistance to the new regime and could not be expected to crown a Protestant queen. The queen was crowned, anointed, presented to the assembled lords and commons, and acclaimed. She made the customary oaths. She received the customary acclamations. She emerged from the abbey shortly after midday as the legitimate anointed sovereign of England. What followed in the early months of 1559 was the religious settlement that would prove, in retrospect, to be one of her great achievements. The settlement was assembled through Parliament during the spring. 2 principal acts were passed. The Act of Supremacy reasserted the royal supremacy over the Church, ending the brief period of restored papal authority under Mary. The Act of Uniformity established a new English prayer book, modelled closely on the Edwardian Book of 1552, but with several deliberate modifications designed to soften its more radical Protestant features. The communion service, in the new book, contained language that could be understood by Catholics as suggestive of a real presence in the elements, as well as language that could be understood by Protestants as merely commemorative. The vestments to be worn by clergy were specified in a way that retained more traditional forms than the Edwardian book had required. The services were to be conducted in English, but the church buildings were to retain, in substantial part, the visual furnishings of the older worship. The passage of these two acts through Parliament was not, however, a smooth process. The bishops, who at this point still consisted almost entirely of men appointed under Mary, were uniformly opposed to both bills. They voted against the Act of Supremacy in the House of Lords. The bills passed only because the lay peers, on the whole, supported the new arrangements, and because the bishops were outnumbered in the upper house. The Act of Uniformity passed the Lords by only 3 votes. The settlement that has come down to us as the Elizabethan Compromise was, in its parliamentary moment, a closely contested piece of legislation that almost did not pass at all. The aftermath required, on the Queen's part, a delicate handling of the church hierarchy. The Marian bishops were required to take the oath of supremacy under the new Act. With 1 or 2 exceptions, they refused. They were deprived of their sees. New bishops, drawn from the returned exile community of Protestants who had spent Mary's reign on the continent, were appointed to fill the vacant sees. The most important of these new appointments was Matthew Parker, a moderate Protestant who had been chaplain to Anne Boleyn many years earlier, and who was now consecrated as Archbishop of Canterbury in December 1559. The succession of Parker to Canterbury, conducted with careful attention to the canonical forms of episcopal consecration, established the apostolic continuity that the new church wished to claim. The argument that the Elizabethan Church remained a true church, in continuity with the Church of the Apostles, and not a new sect created by an Act of Parliament, depended on the legitimacy of Parker's consecration and those who consecrated him. The argument has continued to be debated by theologians for 4 centuries. The settlement was, in its essence, a compromise. It was insufficiently radical for the more committed Protestants, who wanted a thorough purification of the Church on the model of the continental Reformed churches. It was unacceptable in principle to convinced Catholics who could not accept the royal supremacy or the prayer book at all, but it was acceptable to the substantial majority of the English population who were neither thoroughly committed to one position nor the other. It allowed enough flexibility in interpretation that congregations of varying inclinations could attend the same parish church and find in the services something that did not actively offend them. It was in this sense deliberately ambiguous. The ambiguity was not a failure of design, but a feature of it. Elizabeth herself, in her religious views, was probably best described as a moderate Protestant with strong personal preferences for traditional ceremonial elements. She kept a crucifix in her private chapel, which the more zealous reformers found scandalous. She insisted on certain vestments that the Edwardian Church had abandoned. She had no patience with the Puritan party that, throughout her reign, would push for further reformation. But she also had no intention of returning to Catholicism, and her supremacy over the Church was non-negotiable. The settlement she imposed was, in this sense, an extension of her own preferences. It also happened to be the position that gave the country the best chance of internal religious peace. The famous phrase attributed to her, that she did not wish to make windows into men's souls, captured the essential principle. So long as her subjects attended the parish church, conformed outwardly to the prayer book, and accepted her supremacy, she was prepared to leave their interior religious convictions to themselves. The principle was not absolute. There were, throughout her reign, episodes of severe enforcement, particularly against Catholic recusants who refused to attend Anglican services and against Catholic priests who entered England from the continental seminaries. The settlement held. Through the rest of her reign, with adjustments and pressures and the constant managed tension between the Church's various factions, the framework established in 1559 remained in force. The English Reformation, which had been violent and disruptive under her father and her brother and her sister, became, under Elizabeth, slowly a settled fact. The country adjusted itself, generation by generation, to the new arrangement. By the end of her reign, more than 40 years later, the children of those who had been adults in 1559 had grown up in the new church, and the new church had become simply the church. Beyond the religious settlement, the early years of the reign saw the systematic restoration of the country's finances and the careful re-establishment of its diplomatic position. Cecil, working with a small group of trusted colleagues, conducted a recoinage that restored the integrity of the currency. The recoinage, completed in 1561, was one of the great administrative achievements of the reign. The debased coins of the previous reigns were called in. New coins of standard purity were issued in their place. The international markets, which had been discounting English coinage for years, gradually came to accept the new currency at face value. The credit of the English crown, which had been almost ruined by the borrowing of Mary's reign, slowly recovered. Trade with the continent was carefully managed. The English merchants, organised in their various trading companies, were given the support they needed to maintain their export markets, particularly for the woolen cloth that remained, throughout the reign, the principal English export. New trading ventures were undertaken into more distant markets. The Muscovy Company, which had been established in 1555, was developed throughout the reign. The Levant Company was chartered in 1581. The East India Company, which would eventually transform the entire economic relationship between England and Asia, was chartered in the Queen's last full year, in 1600. The patient work of these decades laid the commercial foundations of what would much later become the English Maritime Empire. The military and naval establishments were modestly reformed. The army, which remained throughout the reign a feudal levy supplemented by paid foreign mercenaries, was not transformed in any fundamental way. The navy, however, was the subject of careful and sustained investment. The shipyards at Deptford and Chatham produced new vessels of advanced design. The administrative machinery for naval supply and maintenance was developed steadily. By the time of the Armada in 1588, the English Navy was a force of substantial professional capacity, capable of sustained operations against the major continental powers. The achievement was, in retrospect, one of the foundational accomplishments of the reign. The peace with France, which had been concluded by Mary in difficult terms, was maintained. The relationship with Spain, which had been so close under Mary, was allowed to cool gradually, without any abrupt rupture. The principal Cecil and the Queen jointly applied, throughout these years, was that the country needed peace and time. Both were given to it. Then there was the question of marriage. From the moment of her accession, the question of whom the new queen would marry dominated almost every diplomatic conversation in Europe. She was 25, unmarried, the last surviving child of Henry VIII, the sole obstacle, in the eyes of most observers, to the inheritance of the English throne by some other monarch, or some other dynasty. If she married and produced children, the Tudor line would continue. If she did not, or could not, the succession would have to be settled in some other way, with all the political dangers that any uncertain succession produced. The candidates were many. Philip of Spain, her sister's widower, opened the bidding within weeks of her accession, suggesting that he might marry his late wife's sister and thus retain the English connection that his father had so carefully arranged. Elizabeth, with diplomatic courtesy, declined. Philip then transferred his interest to a niece, Elizabeth of Valois, who eventually became his third wife. Other candidates emerged. Eric of Sweden, who would later become King Eric XIV, Archduke Charles of Austria, the younger son of the Emperor Ferdinand, various French candidates at various times, including in due course the Duke of Anjou and the Duke of Alencon, who would dominate the marriage negotiations of the 1570s and 1580s. There was also within her own kingdom the man whom she actually loved. His name was Robert Dudley. He was, like the Queen, 25 years old. They had known each other since childhood. He was the fifth son of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the same Northumberland whose attempt to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne had ended his career and his life. Robert had been imprisoned in the Tower at the same time as Elizabeth herself, in 1554, for his part in his father's schemes. The two had encountered each other during their imprisonments. Whether the connection between them began at that point, or earlier or later, the historical record does not allow us to specify with certainty. What is clear is that from the first days of her reign, Robert Dudley was a constant presence at her side. He was made Master of the Horse, a position that gave him daily access to the Queen's person. He was given lodgings at court. He was, by every observer's account, the Queen's favourite to a degree that her other courtiers found at best unwise and at worst threatening. The complication was that Robert Dudley was already married. He had married in 1550 when he was 18, a young woman named Amy Robsart, the daughter of a Norfolk gentleman. The marriage had been a love match in its early years. By 1559, however, Amy was living in the country, at the manor of Cumnor near Oxford, in the household of friends, while her husband lived at the Queen's court and saw her rarely. The marriage was, by any reasonable assessment, in a state of advanced separation. The Queen's continuing close relationship with Robert was, in the eyes of every diplomatic observer in Europe, scandalous, although the precise degree of the scandal depended on what the diplomats believed about the actual nature of the relationship. In September 1560, Amy Robsart died. Her death occurred at Cumnor under circumstances that, even at the time, were considered uncertain. She was found at the foot of a staircase in the house with her neck broken. She had been alone in the house, having sent her servants away to a fair that day. The local coroner conducted an inquest. The verdict was accidental death. The verdict was widely doubted. Modern scholarship has produced no definitive resolution of the question. Amy may have died accidentally. She may have killed herself in despair at her marital situation. She may have been killed by Robert's agents, although the evidence for this is thin and would, if it were true, make Robert's subsequent behaviour inexplicable. The most plausible modern view, based on the limited surviving evidence, is that her death was accidental, possibly related to a previously undiagnosed medical condition that had weakened her bones. But the question cannot be settled, and it has been argued for 4 centuries. The political consequences were immediate. Whatever the truth of the matter, Robert Dudley was now, in the eyes of European opinion, a man whose wife had died under suspicious circumstances at exactly the moment when her death was useful to him. Any prospect of his marrying the Queen, which had been openly discussed in some quarters before September 1560, was now destroyed. The Queen herself, who was politically intelligent enough to recognise this, withdrew from the immediate question. She continued to keep Robert close at court. She continued to favour him with grants and offices. She raised him to the peerage as Earl of Leicester in 1564. But the marriage, if it had ever been a serious possibility, was now out of the question, and the Queen knew it. This was, in retrospect, a defining moment. It was also, perhaps, a clarifying one. The Queen had to choose throughout the 1560s between the various marriage candidates that her ministers presented to her. She did not, in the end, choose any of them. The reasons accumulated over the course of the decade into a position that the Queen herself could articulate only partially, even in private. She did not want to marry a foreign prince, who would necessarily come with foreign interests and foreign demands. She did not want to marry an English subject, who would necessarily disturb the careful balance of her own court. She did not perhaps want to marry at all. The married women of her acquaintance had, on the whole, not fared well. Her own mother had been executed by her father. Her stepmother, Catherine Parr, had died in childbirth. Her sister Mary had been humiliated by Philip of Spain. Marriage, for queens, was historically a difficult business, and Elizabeth had no compelling personal reason to enter into it. But the question of marriage could not be openly closed. To declare that she would never marry would have been to undermine her own position, since the prospect of her marriage was, throughout her reign, one of the principal diplomatic instruments available to her. So long as she might marry, foreign powers had to court her. So long as she might marry, her ministers had to consider her potential alliances. So long as she might marry, she retained in the political world of her time a kind of authority that an unmarried woman past her childbearing years would not have retained. The marriage question, then, became throughout the 1560s and 1570s and into the 1580s a kind of permanent political theatre. Suitors came forward, negotiations were conducted, ambassadors were dispatched, portraits were exchanged, conditions were debated. The Queen made encouraging statements at certain points and discouraging statements at others, in patterns that her ministers slowly came to understand were not a reflection of changing intentions, but a reflection of the diplomatic moment. The negotiations with Archduke Charles of Austria, which dominated much of the 1560s, eventually came to nothing. The negotiations with the Duke of Anjou, and later the Duke of Alencon, which dominated much of the 1570s and early 1580s, similarly came to nothing. The Duke of Alencon, who was the younger of these French candidates, actually came to England in 1579 and again in 1581, conducting his suit in person, and at one point the Queen apparently considered the marriage seriously enough to confide her decision in favour of it to a few close advisers, before reversing herself within weeks. The episode caused considerable political turmoil at the time, and has been studied by biographers ever since for what it tells us about her actual feelings. By the mid-1580s, when the Queen was in her early 50s, the question was effectively settled by biology. She would not now bear children. The marriage negotiations, which had been one of the principal diplomatic instruments of her reign for 25 years, gradually wound down. The country, which had been waiting throughout this period for the Queen's marriage and the production of a Tudor heir, had to accept that the heir would not appear, and that the succession question would have to be resolved in some other way. The decade and a half during which the marriage question had dominated her court deserves more attention than the bare political summary suggests, because it shaped the entire texture of her early and middle reign in ways that the documents of the period make abundantly clear. The court of Elizabeth in the 1560s and 1570s was a court permanently engaged in the choreography of a possible royal marriage, and the consequences of that choreography reached into almost every aspect of public and private life. The diplomatic dimension was the most visible. Every major European court maintained ambassadors at Whitehall and at Greenwich, whose principal task, beyond the ordinary business of diplomacy, was to monitor and report on the marriage question. The ambassadors of Spain, of France, of the Empire, of the smaller German principalities, of Sweden, all wrote regular dispatches home in which the Queen's apparent inclinations, her conversations at audience, her dances, her gestures, her dress, were analysed for what they might suggest about her openness to particular suitors. The dispatches that survive are among the richest sources we have for understanding the daily life of the early reign. They are also, in their accumulated weight, somewhat exhausting. Every minor incident at court was scrutinised. Every chance remark was reported. Every gift sent or received was tabulated. The Queen lived throughout these years under a constant diplomatic surveillance that almost no other ruler of her era experienced to the same degree. The domestic dimension was equally significant. The Queen's counsellors, particularly Cecil and his colleagues, regarded the marriage question as the central political problem of the reign. The country needed an heir. The succession, if she died unmarried and without children, would be deeply contested. Several candidates could plausibly claim the throne in such a circumstance, and the prospect of a succession war was real. Cecil and his colleagues pressed the marriage question on her year after year in formal council meetings and in private audiences, in petitions from Parliament, and in solemn delegations from the bishops. The Queen received these pressures with various forms of polite evasion. Sometimes she encouraged a particular suitor, sometimes she discouraged one. Sometimes she returned to candidates who had been thought rejected, reopening negotiations that her ministers had thought closed. The pattern over years was so consistent that the council eventually began to suspect, although it could not openly say, that the Queen had no real intention of marrying anyone, and that the marriage question was being kept alive by her not as a real possibility, but as a useful instrument. Whether this was a deliberate strategy from the start, or whether it emerged gradually as the Queen's preferences became clearer to herself, the historical record cannot definitively establish. The Queen's own statements on the subject throughout her life were carefully designed to avoid foreclosure. In her first speech to Parliament in February 1559, only weeks after her accession, she had addressed the marriage question in terms that her audience found difficult to pass. She had said that she had been content with the single life since her youth, that she had often considered the calls of God's providence as suggesting that her position was a particular one, but that she would consider any proposal that her Parliament made to her on the subject. The phrasing was characteristic. She had not committed herself to anything. She had also not closed any door. The members of Parliament left her presence not knowing whether she would marry or not. Throughout the 1560s, this pattern continued. When pressed directly, she gave answers that left her room for manoeuvre. She referred to her coronation ring, which she sometimes called her wedding ring, suggesting that she was already married to her people. She referred to the children she might one day have, suggesting that a marriage was still possible. She referred to her advancing age and the difficulty of childbearing for older mothers, suggesting that the prospect was diminishing. She varied her tone according to her audience and her mood. The cumulative effect was to make any clear conclusion impossible. The relationship with Robert Dudley throughout this period was the most difficult feature of the entire question for her ministers to manage. They could not approve of him. He had been the husband of a woman who had died under suspicious circumstances. He was the son of a traitor. His own military and administrative capacities, while real, were not at the level that some of his admirers claimed for him. He was, in the council's collective judgment, a man whose elevation through marriage to the Queen would create more problems than it solved. They told her so repeatedly, in language that was as direct as any 16th century minister could afford to use to a sovereign. She did not marry him. The arrangement that emerged over the 1560s was a peculiar form of permanent intimacy without formal commitment. Dudley remained at court. He was given lodgings in the palaces. He was the Queen's regular companion in the formal life of court, and in such recreations as hunting and dancing. He was raised to the peerage as Earl of Leicester in 1564, with a substantial grant of lands. He was given administrative responsibilities. He was, by every measurable standard, the most important man at the Queen's court for the next 25 years, but he was never her husband. The intimacy between them, although close, was managed with a discretion that the Queen had imposed and that he, eventually, accepted. Whether the relationship had ever been physical in any sense beyond the public courtesies, the historical evidence does not allow us to determine. Almost certainly, given the political circumstances and the Queen's particular caution on questions of reputation, it was not. The public claim that she was the Virgin Queen would not have been sustainable for 40 years if the daily life of her court had contradicted it visibly. But the depth of feeling between them, on her side as well as his, was real, and the constraint she had imposed upon them both was the price she had paid, and made him pay, for the political position she had decided was hers. Leicester, for his part, eventually understood that he would not marry the Queen. He married in 1578 in secret the Queen's cousin Lettice Knollys, the widow of the Earl of Essex. The marriage, when it became known to the Queen, produced one of the great rages of her life. She did not speak to Leicester for weeks. She refused to receive Lettice at court ever again, a refusal that lasted to the end of Lettice's life. The marriage was a betrayal, in her view, of the unspoken arrangement that had governed their relationship for 2 decades. But the rage passed eventually, and Leicester returned to favour, although Lettice did not. The Queen had decided, at some level she could not articulate, that he could be married to someone else as long as she did not have to acknowledge that fact. The contradictions of the relationship were never resolved. They simply continued, alongside the political continuities, until Leicester's death in September 1588, only weeks after the defeat of the Armada that had been, in its way, the great public triumph of their long-shared career. The other principal marriage candidate of the reign, the one who came closest to actually marrying her, was the French Duke of Anjou, who later became, on his elder brother's promotion, the Duke of Alencon. The negotiations with the French court, which extended through the 1570s and into the early 1580s, produced one of the strangest episodes of her personal life. Alencon, who was 22 when serious negotiations began in 1579 and the Queen was 46, was no conventional romantic figure. He was small in stature, marked by smallpox, with an oddly shaped face that even sympathetic observers described as unattractive. The Queen, when she finally met him in person during his visit to England in 1579, found him, against her own expectations, charming. They communicated in French, in which she was fluent. They danced together. He gave her gifts. She called him, in private letters that survive, her frog, an affectionate nickname that referred both to his ambassadorial origin and to his appearance. For some weeks in 1579 and again in 1581, the marriage seemed to those at court to be a real possibility. The Queen confided to a small group of her closest advisers that she had decided to accept the proposal. She wept when she informed her senior councillors of her intention. She asked them, in tears, to support her. The reactions varied. Some, including Cecil, accepted the decision with reservations and began to prepare for the marriage. Others, including Walsingham, opposed it strongly on religious grounds, since Alencon was a Catholic, and the marriage would, they argued, compromise the Protestant character of the English settlement. The Earl of Sussex supported the marriage. The Earl of Leicester, perhaps unsurprisingly given his own continuing relationship with the Queen, opposed it. The matter was settled in the end, not by the council's deliberations, but by the country's reaction. A pamphlet was published in the autumn of 1579 by a Puritan writer named John Stubbs, attacking the proposed marriage in language so vehement that it caused widespread public alarm. Stubbs was prosecuted for sedition. He was condemned to lose his right hand, the punishment then prescribed for seditious writing. The sentence was carried out in public, and according to a famous account, Stubbs, after losing his hand, raised his hat with his remaining hand and cried out, "God save the Queen." The episode was politically unforgettable. The country the Queen had been forced to recognise was not ready to accept a Catholic foreign prince as its king consort. Whatever her own inclinations, the marriage was not politically viable. The negotiations dragged on for another 2 years, with the Queen oscillating between encouragement and discouragement, until they finally collapsed in the early 1580s. Alencon died in 1584, of natural causes, at the age of 29. The Queen, on hearing the news, wept. The last serious marriage negotiation of her life had ended. She was 50. The question, which had been dominant for a quarter of a century, was now effectively settled. The other way, in fact, was the question that increasingly dominated the political life of her reign. There was throughout the 1560s and beyond a clear next-in-line claimant to the English throne. Her name was Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, and her claim was through her grandmother, Margaret Tudor, the elder sister of Henry VIII, who had been married to King James IV of Scotland in 1503, and from whom the Stuart line of Scotland descended. Mary's biography by 1568 was already extraordinary, even by the standards of 16th century royalty. She had been crowned Queen of Scots at the age of 9 months in 1542, after her father's death within days of her birth. She had been sent to France at the age of 5, to be raised at the French court and to be married, in due course, to the heir to the French throne. The marriage had taken place in 1558, when she was 15 and her husband, the Dauphin Francis, was 14. Her husband had become King Francis II of France in 1559. He had died of an ear infection that became a brain infection in December 1560. Mary had returned to Scotland in 1561, an 18-year-old widow, to take up the active rule of a country she had not seen since early childhood, and whose religious settlement, established under her absence, was in the process of becoming firmly Protestant under the leadership of John Knox. The years that followed were a chaotic personal and political failure. Mary, a Catholic queen of a Protestant country, struggled to govern. She married, in 1565, her cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a marriage that produced a son, the future James VI of Scotland and James I of England, but that quickly turned disastrous. Darnley was vain, weak, and politically destructive. He participated, in 1566, in the murder of Mary's secretary David Rizzio in her own apartments and in her presence, while she was pregnant. The marriage was effectively over. In February 1567, Darnley was killed in an explosion at the house where he was lodging on the outskirts of Edinburgh. The principal suspect was the Earl of Bothwell, a leading Scottish noble who had been close to Mary in the months preceding. Within 3 months of Darnley's death, Mary married Bothwell, an action that destroyed her remaining political support. By July 1567, she had been forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son. By May 1568, she had escaped from imprisonment in Scotland, raised an army, lost a battle, and fled across the border into England. She had come to England in the expectation, or at least the hope, of receiving sympathetic support from her cousin the Queen. Her position, after all, was that of a fellow sovereign who had been overthrown by her own subjects, and who was seeking the assistance of a fellow ruler in regaining her throne. She did not anticipate that her arrival would create one of the most difficult political problems of her cousin's reign, but it did, and the problem would persist for the next 19 years. The two queens, throughout this entire period, never met in person. The arrangements for a meeting had been considered several times, particularly in the early years before the political situation had hardened, but each proposed meeting had been postponed for one reason or another, and eventually the prospect of a face-to-face encounter became too politically dangerous to contemplate. They communicated, throughout the 19 years of Mary's English imprisonment, only by letter. The correspondence, which survives in considerable bulk, is one of the most poignant bodies of writing in the Tudor record. Mary wrote to her cousin in tones that ranged from sisterly affection to angry reproach to desperate pleading. Elizabeth replied, when she replied at all, in language that was carefully measured, that promised nothing, and that committed itself to no specific course of action. The two women, who were each other's nearest royal kinswoman, and who shared, in a sense, the strange isolation of being queens regnant in a culture that had not entirely come to terms with the idea of a female ruler, never resolved the question of what they were to each other. Mary could not be allowed to return to Scotland with English support, because the Scottish Protestant government was an English ally, and any English action against it would be politically and diplomatically disastrous. Mary could not be allowed to leave England for France or Spain, because either of those Catholic powers might use her as the basis for a campaign to restore Catholicism to Scotland and ultimately to England. Mary could not be returned to Scotland against her will, because the Scottish lords would almost certainly execute her, and Elizabeth could not be seen to deliver a fellow sovereign to her death. Mary could not be released to live freely in England, because she would immediately become the focus of every Catholic and dissatisfied faction in the country. What Mary could be was a prisoner. She was placed in a series of country houses under the supervision of trusted Protestant nobles: Bolton Castle in Yorkshire, Tutbury in Staffordshire, Sheffield Castle, Chatsworth, Wingfield. The conditions of her imprisonment were comfortable in physical terms. She had a household, she had her ladies, she had her dogs and her embroidery and her prayer books. She had access, intermittently, to her own diplomatic correspondence with her supporters abroad. She did not have liberty. The man who was charged with her custody for most of the long imprisonment was George Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, a senior Protestant peer with a substantial estate and a reputation for reliability. Mary was placed in his care in 1569 and remained with various changes of residence between his properties under his keeping until 1584. The arrangement cost Shrewsbury enormously. The maintenance of Mary's household, although nominally funded by the Crown, was in practice borne in substantial part by Shrewsbury himself, since the Crown's payments were always insufficient and frequently delayed. Shrewsbury's marriage to the formidable Bess of Hardwicke deteriorated steadily over the years of Mary's imprisonment, partly because of the strains the imprisonment imposed on the household, and partly because of the more personal tensions that the presence of a captive queen produced. By the early 1580s, the marriage had effectively collapsed, and the Queen finally appointed a different keeper, Sir Amyas Paulet, a strict Puritan who would conduct the final years of the imprisonment with a severity that Shrewsbury had not been willing to impose. Mary, throughout these years, did not resign herself to her position. She wrote year after year to anyone who might help her. She corresponded with her son James, who was being raised as a Protestant in Scotland, and who showed, increasingly, no interest in his mother's cause. She corresponded with the French court, where her in-laws and former hosts had their own political problems and were unwilling to commit to her restoration. She corresponded with Philip of Spain, whose interest in her cause grew slowly throughout the 1570s and 1580s as his own confrontation with Protestant England developed. She corresponded with the Pope, who supported her cause in principle, but had limited practical means to act on her behalf. She received, from each of these correspondents, sympathy and occasional financial support, but no decisive intervention. She also corresponded with the various plotters and conspirators who, throughout the years of her imprisonment, formed and reformed schemes for her liberation and for the restoration of Catholicism in England. Whether she knew, in each case, the full nature of the plot she was being drawn into is a question that has been debated by historians for centuries. The evidence of her direct involvement varies from plot to plot. In some cases, she was clearly an active participant, encouraging the conspirators and pledging her support for their plans. In others, she was a passive figure whose name was used by others without her informed consent. The cumulative effect, however, was to make her presence in England a permanent source of political danger, and to make any final resolution of her case increasingly inevitable. The first major plot to free her began in 1569. The Northern Earls, the Earl of Northumberland and the Earl of Westmoreland, who were Catholic and disaffected from the new religious settlement, raised a rebellion in the north of England with the intention of liberating Mary. Marrying her to the Duke of Norfolk, the leading English Catholic peer, and placing her on the throne in place of Elizabeth, the Northern Rebellion, as it came to be called, was put down within weeks. The two earls fled to Scotland and from there into exile. Northumberland was eventually handed back to the English authorities and executed in 1572. Westmoreland died in poverty on the continent some years later. Norfolk, who had been peripherally involved, was arrested and held in the Tower for several months before being released. The rebellion's failure made clear how the future would unfold. Mary's name would be invoked again and again by every group that wished to overturn the existing settlement. The plots would multiply. The danger to Elizabeth would grow. The next major plot was the Ridolfi conspiracy of 1571, in which an Italian banker, Roberto di Ridolfi, served as the link between Mary Norfolk, the Duke of Alba in the Netherlands, and the Pope in a complex scheme to invade England, depose Elizabeth, and restore Catholicism. The plot was discovered by Cecil's intelligence networks. Norfolk was implicated and condemned to death. The execution of Norfolk in June 1572 was the moment at which the Queen had to be most directly persuaded to consent to the death of a leading peer, and her difficulty in signing the warrant was an early indication of the personal cost she would pay throughout her reign for the executions her position required of her. She had signed the warrant once, in February 1572, and then withdrawn it. She had signed it again in April. She had finally signed it in May, with the warrant being executed within days. The pattern of agonized hesitation, followed by reluctant consent, was one she would repeat 15 years later in the matter of Mary herself. The Throckmorton plot of 1583 was another conspiracy involving English Catholics, French and Spanish support, and a planned invasion. Francis Throckmorton, the principal English conspirator, was arrested in November 1583. Under torture, he revealed the outline of the plot, including the involvement of the Spanish ambassador, Bernardino de Mendoza. Mendoza was expelled from England in January 1584, the first major rupture of formal diplomatic relations between England and Spain in the reign. The expulsion was a significant moment. The two countries had maintained diplomatic representation, despite increasing tensions, for the entire reign so far. Mendoza's expulsion marked the point at which the relationship had become in effect a state of suspended hostility, even though formal war was still 4 years away. The Throckmorton plot also produced, indirectly, a piece of legislation that would prove central to the eventual resolution of Mary's case. The Bond of Association, drawn up in 1584 by Cecil and Walsingham, was a public oath taken by leading subjects committing themselves to pursue and execute anyone who attempted the Queen's life or who would benefit from her death. The bond was signed by thousands of supporters across the country, in elaborate ceremonies organised by local officials. Its political purpose was to demonstrate to Mary and to her potential supporters that any plot against the Queen would result in Mary's death, even if Mary herself had been unaware of the plot. The bond was given statutory force in 1585 by an Act for the Queen's Surety, which provided the legal mechanism by which Mary could eventually be tried and executed if implicated in any conspiracy against Elizabeth. The Babington plot of 1586 was the one that finally proved fatal to Mary herself. Anthony Babington was a young English Catholic gentleman who had been drawn into a circle of conspirators planning the assassination of Elizabeth and the placement of Mary on the throne. Mary, by this point, had been a prisoner for 18 years. She was 43. She was in poor health. She had become increasingly desperate. Her correspondence with the Babington conspirators, which she conducted through a courier whom she did not realise was a double agent of Cecil's spymaster Francis Walsingham, included, in July 1586, a letter approving the assassination of Elizabeth in principle. The mechanism by which Walsingham trapped her was one of the most elaborate intelligence operations of the entire Tudor period. A double agent, named Gilbert Giffard, had been recruited by Walsingham to serve as the channel for Mary's secret correspondence. The conspirators, believing Giffard to be loyal to their cause, used him to deliver letters to and from Mary's household. The letters were smuggled in and out of Chartley, where Mary was being held by then, in a beer barrel passed through the brewery that supplied the household. Giffard, before delivering each letter, brought it first to Walsingham's cipher specialist, Thomas Felipes, who copied it, deciphered it, and then resealed the original to be delivered. Walsingham thus had a complete record of Mary's correspondence with the conspirators, while Mary believed her communications to be secure. The letter approving the assassination was the evidence that Walsingham had been waiting for. Felipes, after deciphering it, drew a small gallows in the margin of his copy as a kind of professional note that the case was now sufficient. The conspirators were arrested in August. Babington and his closest associates were tried and executed in September. The execution of the principal conspirators was conducted with a particular brutality in the older Tudor style of public execution for treason, that the Queen herself, on hearing the details, ordered to be moderated for the second batch of conspirators executed the following day. The brutality of the first executions had produced, even among ordinary Londoners, a sense of revulsion that the Queen wished not to deepen. Mary was tried in October 1586 at Fotheringhay Castle, where she was being held. The trial was conducted by a commission of English peers and judges. The evidence presented was substantial. Mary defended herself with the dignity that had characterized her entire long imprisonment, refusing to accept the legitimacy of the court that tried her, since she insisted, a sovereign queen who could not be tried by the subjects of another sovereign. The argument was logically sound but politically irrelevant. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. The execution did not, however, follow immediately. The death warrant required the Queen's signature. Elizabeth, presented with the warrant by Cecil, refused for weeks to sign it. She walked the gardens at Greenwich and at Whitehall in agonized indecision. She wrote letters to advisers asking what she should do. She summoned and dismissed councillors. She prayed. The execution of a fellow sovereign who was also her cousin was, in her view, a step that could not be taken lightly. There were also serious diplomatic consequences to consider. The execution would be deeply unpopular in Catholic Europe and might provoke Spain and France into actions that English foreign policy was struggling to manage. She also explored throughout these weeks alternative solutions that her ministers regarded as scarcely respectable. She suggested to her councillors that someone might be found who would arrange Mary's death by less formal means, sparing the Queen the public responsibility of having ordered an execution. The councillors, including Walsingham, were genuinely shocked by these suggestions and refused to entertain them. The Queen was being asked to take responsibility for an act she did not want to take responsibility for, and her search for any alternative was, in retrospect, both characteristic of her personal style and indicative of the depth of her reluctance. In February 1587, after months of indecision, the Queen finally signed the warrant. She signed it without explicitly handing it over to be carried to Fotheringhay, expecting, perhaps, that it would not be acted upon. Cecil and the Council, however, immediately dispatched the warrant to Fotheringhay through their own channels, in a meeting of which the Queen had not been informed. Mary was beheaded on the morning of the 8th of February 1587, in the great hall of the castle. Her death was carried out, as Anne Boleyn's had been, by a single executioner with an axe. The execution was performed badly. The first stroke missed. The second stroke severed most of the neck, but not entirely. The third stroke completed the work. Mary was buried at Peterborough Cathedral, in a service conducted with the formal honours due to a queen, although the political circumstances of her death meant that the funeral was a muted affair. When the news reached Elizabeth at Greenwich, She fell into a fury that was by all accounts more violent and more sustained than any her household had previously witnessed. She blamed Cecil, she blamed the council, she blamed her secretary William Davison, who had carried the warrant to Cecil and who became the official scapegoat for the action. She wept. She refused to eat. She refused to allow Cecil into her presence for weeks. The performance was, at one level, transparently political. The Queen needed to dissociate herself for foreign consumption from the execution she had in fact authorized. But the personal grief beneath the political performance was also real. She had ordered the death of her own cousin, her fellow queen, the woman who had been the heir presumptive to her throne for 19 years. The cost was real, and she paid it in her own way, and she did not forget. Davison was arrested, tried by the Star Chamber, fined a substantial sum, and committed to the Tower. He was eventually released and quietly retired from public life. He had, throughout his career, served the Queen faithfully, and the punishment imposed upon him was a piece of public theatre rather than a real disgrace. The councillors who had pressed the Queen to sign the warrant and who had then arranged for it to be carried out without her further authorization had calculated correctly that the Queen would need a scapegoat, and that one of their number would have to take the role. Davison was the chosen sacrifice. He understood his function, accepted his punishment with dignity, and lived out his remaining years on a modest pension that the Queen quietly arranged for him. The execution of Mary, however necessary in the eyes of her ministers, did not solve the larger international problem. It made it worse. The Catholic powers of Europe, who had been growing increasingly hostile to Elizabeth's England throughout the 1580s, now had a martyr. Philip of Spain, in particular, who had spent years constructing an argument for action against England, found in Mary's death the final justification for the great enterprise he had been planning for years. The relationship between Elizabeth and England and the Spain of Philip II had been deteriorating for 2 decades by the time of the Armada. The two powers had, in Mary Tudor's time, been formally allied through the marriage of Mary and Philip. After Mary's death and Elizabeth's accession, the alliance had wound down gradually through the early 1560s, as Elizabeth's Protestant settlement made it clear that England would not return to the Catholic fold. Through the later 1560s and the 1570s, several specific points of conflict had emerged. The Spanish suppression of the Protestant rebellion in the Netherlands, conducted with notorious harshness by the Duke of Alba and his successors, had alarmed English public opinion and had drawn substantial English support, both popular and eventually official, for the Dutch Protestant cause. The activities of English privateers, particularly Francis Drake, against Spanish shipping in the Caribbean and along the South American coast, had cost Spain substantial losses and had been conducted with the Queen's tacit support, even when her formal disavowal of them was demanded. The English support for the French Protestant cause in the wars of religion that were tearing France apart in the same period had similarly run against Spanish interests. By the early 1580s, Philip had begun to consider direct action against England as a strategic necessity. The decision was not impulsive. He was a careful, slow-moving monarch who consulted his councillors at length and who weighed alternatives over years rather than months. But by 1586, with the Mary plots culminating in the Babington conspiracy, with the English military intervention in the Netherlands becoming open under the command of the Earl of Leicester, and with the Pope offering both spiritual and financial support for the enterprise, Philip had committed to the project that would become the Armada. The plan was ambitious. A vast Spanish fleet was to sail from Lisbon up the English Channel to the Netherlands. There it was to embark a Spanish army, which had been positioned along the coast under the command of the Duke of Parma, the most successful Spanish general of his generation. The combined force was then to invade England, depose Elizabeth, and restore Catholicism by force. The fleet that finally sailed in May 1588 numbered approximately 130 ships. It carried in its complement perhaps 30,000 men. It was the largest naval force ever assembled in European history to that point. It was commanded by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, an able administrator who, by his own admission, had little experience of naval command and who had accepted the appointment with reluctance. The original commander, the Marquis of Santa Cruz, who had spent years preparing the expedition, had died in February 1588, and Medina Sidonia had been appointed in his place at very short notice. The English response had been carefully prepared. The English fleet, which was smaller in tonnage but consisted of newer, faster, more manoeuvrable ships, was assembled under the command of Lord Howard of Effingham, with Francis Drake and John Hawkins as senior officers. The fleet had been built up steadily over the previous decade, with John Hawkins as Treasurer of the Navy, supervising the design and construction of new vessels with characteristics specifically chosen for the kind of warfare the English expected to conduct. The new ships were lower in the water than their Spanish counterparts, longer in proportion to their beam, with a higher proportion of their guns positioned to fire broadsides at long range rather than for the boarding actions that Spanish naval doctrine still favoured. The English approach to naval warfare, which had been developing through the privateering campaigns of Drake and Hawkins, emphasised gunnery at distance over the close action that had dominated naval warfare for the previous century. The shore defences of southern England had also been mobilised. Beacon networks had been established along the coasts to provide warning of the Armada's approach. A force was gathered at Tilbury, near London, under the command of the Earl of Leicester, the Queen's old favourite Robert Dudley, to defend against any Spanish landing. The county militias had been called up. The supplies had been assembled. The country, by mid-July 1588, was as ready as a 16th century state could make itself for the largest military challenge it had faced in living memory. The Armada was sighted off the coast of Cornwall on the 19th of July 1588. The beacons flared along the southern coast through the evening and into the night. Within hours the news had reached London and the Queen at Richmond. The English fleet sailed out from Plymouth and began the long-running engagement that would carry both fleets up the Channel over the following week. The fighting was indecisive at first. The English ships, with their superior manoeuvrability and their longer-range artillery, were able to harass the Spanish formation, but not to break it. The Spanish ships, sailing in a tight crescent formation that protected the troop transports in the centre, presented a target that the English could attack but not penetrate. Over several days, the running battles up the Channel produced casualties on both sides but no decisive engagement. The Spanish fleet pressed on towards its rendezvous with Parma. The English fleet, harassing constantly, could not stop them. The crisis came at Calais. The Armada anchored off the French port on the 28th of July, intending to make contact with Parma's army for the embarkation that was the central object of the entire campaign. Parma, however, was not ready. His army had been assembled, but his transport ships, which were intended to ferry the troops out to the Armada in the Channel, had been blockaded by Dutch shallow-draft vessels in the inland ports. He could not bring his troops out to the fleet. The Armada, anchored off Calais, was waiting for an embarkation that could not happen. The English fleet, finding the Armada anchored, sent in fire ships during the night of the 28th. The fire ships were ordinary vessels, 8 of them on this occasion, loaded with combustibles, set alight, and steered towards the enemy fleet by skeleton crews who jumped overboard at the last moment. The technique was an old one, but it was psychologically devastating in its effect. The Spanish ships, fearing a more elaborate attack, and remembering particularly the explosive fire ships that had been used against Parma's bridge at Antwerp 3 years earlier, cut their cables and scattered into the open sea. The careful formation that had held throughout the run up the channel was broken. The next day, off Gravelines, the English fleet engaged the scattered Spanish ships in the most decisive battle of the campaign. The English used their artillery advantage at close range, hammering the Spanish hulls and rigging without coming within boarding distance. Several Spanish ships were sunk or driven ashore. The Spanish fleet, although its core formation began to reassemble during the day, had taken substantial damage. By evening, the Spanish admirals, recognizing that they could not return through the channel against the English fleet and the prevailing winds, decided to attempt to return to Spain by sailing north around Scotland and Ireland. The voyage home was disastrous. The Atlantic storms of the late summer struck the Spanish fleet as it rounded the north of Scotland and the western coast of Ireland. Ship after ship was wrecked on the rocky coasts. The Irish coast in particular became a graveyard for Spanish vessels. Crews who reached land faced varying receptions. Some were taken prisoner and treated as captured combatants under the conventions of the time. Others, particularly along the more remote stretches of the Irish coast, met fates that the official records describe in restrained language. The English authorities in Ireland, fearing that Spanish survivors might rally local Irish Catholic support, gave orders that survivors should not be permitted to remain in arms. The implementation of these orders, in the chaotic conditions of August and September 1588, produced outcomes that varied widely from place to place. Of the approximately 130 ships that had sailed from Lisbon in May, perhaps half returned to Spain by the autumn. The losses in personnel were even higher. Many of the survivors who reached Spanish ports were sick or wounded. The Armada had been, in military terms, defeated by a combination of English seamanship, the action of the fire ships, the failure of Parma to make the rendezvous, and the weather of the North Atlantic. The exact apportionment of credit between these factors has been debated by historians for 400 years. What is clear is that the invasion of England, which had been the principal strategic objective of Philip II for over 2 years, had failed completely. The English commemorative medal struck after the Armada bore the inscription, in Latin, God blew, and they were scattered. The phrasing was apt. The English fleet had inflicted significant damage during the running battles up the Channel and at Gravelines, but the final destruction of the Spanish forces had been accomplished by the storms of the Atlantic, and the English felt no embarrassment in attributing the outcome to divine providence, rather than to their own efforts alone. The Queen herself, throughout the crisis, had been at Tilbury with the army assembled there for the defence of London. The visit took place on the 8th and 9th of August, when the Armada had already been driven from the Channel, but when the danger of a landing by Parma's army was still considered to be present. The Queen rode through the lines of soldiers on a white horse, dressed in a steel cuirass over a white gown, with the Earl of Leicester walking on one side of her and the Earl of Essex, then a young man at the start of his career at court, on the other. She addressed the troops at some point during the visit, in a speech of which the most famous version was first published 20 years later. Whether she actually delivered the speech that has come down to us in her name is a question that has been debated by historians. The speech, as it has been preserved, contains the lines, "I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." The text was first published 20 years after the event, in a collection by Lionel Sharp, who claimed to have been present, and the surviving accounts of the Queen's actual address at Tilbury are too brief and too divergent to allow any confident reconstruction of what was actually said. But something was said on horseback before the assembled troops on a day in early August 1588, when the country was waiting for news of whether the Armada had succeeded in landing Parma's army on the southern coast. The Queen's presence with her troops at that moment, whatever her exact words, was the kind of visible courage that English popular memory has not been wrong to celebrate. The defeat of the Armada was the great public triumph of her reign. The country celebrated in an explosion of relief and patriotic fervour that produced, over the years that followed, much of the cultural material we now think of as Elizabethan. Thanksgiving services were held in cathedrals and parish churches across England. Commemorative tapestries were commissioned by the Lord Admiral. Medals were struck. Sermons were preached. The story of the Queen riding to Tilbury, of Drake calmly finishing his game of bowls before sailing out to engage the Spanish, of the fire ships at Calais, of the Atlantic storms that completed the Spanish destruction, became part of the foundational narrative of English national identity for the next 4 centuries. The plays of Shakespeare, who was beginning his career in London in exactly these years, were written for an audience whose recent experience included the defeat of the Spanish invasion. The Elizabethan navy that defeated the Armada became the foundation of an English maritime tradition that would eventually produce the largest empire in human history. The cult of the Queen as the divinely appointed protector of Protestant England, which had been growing throughout the 1580s, now became the central organising myth of English identity for the rest of the reign. The Queen herself, who was now 55, entered the period of her life that has come down to us in the famous portraits as the Virgin Queen. The image is not a simple one. It was constructed deliberately by the Queen and her advisers as a way of managing the political problem of an unmarried elderly female sovereign in a culture that had no precedent for such a figure. The image used the language of virginity, of unmarried purity, of the goddess Diana, of the moon, of the rose of the pelican, feeding her young with her own blood, in a complex iconographic program that turned the Queen's unmarried state from a political vulnerability into a political asset. The portraits of these years, painted by Nicholas Hilliard and others, show the Queen in elaborate stylized poses, encrusted with pearls, surrounded by emblematic objects, dressed in gowns that no human body could comfortably have worn. The effect was deliberate. The portraits were not intended to record what the Queen actually looked like. They were intended to project her authority, her majesty, her connection to a complex web of religious and mythological associations. The actual woman, who was now in her late 50s and beginning to suffer the physical effects of age, was disappearing behind the constructed icon. The most famous of these images is the so-called Armada portrait, painted in several versions in the years immediately after 1588. The Queen stands in a richly embroidered gown, her hand resting on a globe with her fingers covering the Americas, while behind her 2 views of the Armada appear in the background, one showing the English fleet engaging the Spanish, the other showing the Spanish ships wrecked on a stormy coast. The composition is, in iconographic terms, a complete summary of the political claims that the Queen and her advisers wished to make. The Queen as the protector of Protestantism, mistress of the seas, the queen whose reach extended to the New World, the queen whose authority was vindicated by the providential defeat of her enemies. Every element of the painting was intended to be read. But the rainbow portrait, painted around 1600 when the queen was nearing 70, took the iconographic program to its furthest extreme. The queen, depicted as a young woman although she was nearing the end of her life, holds a rainbow in her hand. Her gown is embroidered with eyes and ears, suggesting omniscience. A serpent of wisdom is woven into her sleeve. The Latin motto, non sine soliris, no rainbow without the sun, suggests her role as the source of order and clarity in her kingdom. The painting was not realism. It was political theology in oil paint. It served, with the other late portraits, as a kind of sustained visual argument for the legitimacy of an aged, unmarried female ruler in a culture that had no other obvious framework for understanding such a figure. The court life of the 1590s, in which these portraits were produced, had a particular texture that contemporary observers found both impressive and slightly strange. The Queen still held court daily. She still received ambassadors. She still attended chapel with her household. She still went on her summer progresses through the country, although the progresses had become shorter and more cautiously planned as she aged. But the daily rhythm of the court was now organised around an elaborate set of ceremonial conventions that the younger generation of courtiers had grown up with, and that they performed, on the whole, with genuine devotion. The court gathered, throughout these years, around the icon with a kind of theatrical devotion that observers found at once impressive and slightly disturbing. The young men of the Queen's later years, who had not been alive at her accession, and who knew her only as the figure she had become, courted her in the elaborate rhetorical conventions that the iconography had produced. They wrote her sonnets. They composed masques in her honour. They knelt to her in postures of exaggerated chivalric devotion. The Queen herself participated in the performances, holding court in great public ceremonies, dancing with her favourites, accepting their poetic addresses with apparent pleasure. The literary culture of the period, particularly in its courtly forms, was shaped throughout by this iconographic programme. Edmund Spenser's great epic poem, The Fairy Queen, published in 2 instalments in 1590 and 1596, was an extended allegorical celebration of the Queen, in which various of her virtues were embodied in different female characters. Walter Raleigh, who was both poet and courtier, addressed her in poems that depicted her as a goddess of the moon, with himself as the ocean drawn to her gravitational influence. The masques performed at court on great occasions wove the Queen into elaborate mythological narratives in which she appeared as Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice, returning to a fallen world to restore the Golden Age. The whole apparatus was a kind of sustained literary devotion that, while its theological content was conventional, had no real precedent in English court culture. Beyond the literary court, the broader Elizabethan literary moment of the late 1580s and 1590s was producing, in its public theatres, a body of work that has continued to be read and performed for 4 centuries. Christopher Marlowe wrote his great plays in the late 1580s and early 1590s. Before his early death in 1593, Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy, one of the foundational works of English revenge tragedy, was probably first performed around 1587. William Shakespeare, who arrived in London in the late 1580s or early 1590s, produced his first plays through the 1590s, with Henry VI, Richard III, the early comedies, The lyric poems Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, and eventually Romeo and Juliet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, the second tetralogy of history plays, and the great mature comedies and tragedies. The literary explosion of these years was, in retrospect, one of the most remarkable single chapters in the history of any vernacular literature, and it took place under the patronage of the Queen and her court in ways both direct and indirect. The court was, however, also a place of practical politics, and the practical politics of the 1590s was difficult. The country was at war with Spain, in a conflict that had begun before the Armada and continued for the rest of the reign. The war was expensive. The treasury, which had been carefully husbanded by Cecil through the 1560s and 1570s, was being steadily drained by military expenses through the 1580s and 1590s. Taxes were raised. The Crown's lands were sold or granted to courtiers in exchange for services. The system of monopolies, in which the Queen granted to particular individuals the exclusive right to deal in particular commodities, was extended and abused, producing widespread complaint by the end of the reign. There was also the Long Irish War, which began in 1594 with the rebellion of Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, and which continued until shortly after the Queen's death. The Irish War was a constant drain on English military and financial resources throughout the 1590s. It produced no decisive results during the Queen's lifetime. The successive English commanders sent to suppress the rebellion either failed or, in the case of Essex, returned home in disgrace. There was also a series of bad harvests in the mid-1590s, which produced widespread food shortages and considerable popular distress. The years 1594 to 1597 saw 4 successive poor harvests, the worst run of agricultural failure in living memory. Bread prices doubled and tripled in many parts of the country. The poor laws, which had been developed in pieces over the course of the reign, were tested severely. Local authorities in many towns and counties had to organise emergency food supplies for populations whose ordinary means of subsistence had broken down. The famine of these years, although it did not produce mass starvation on the scale that some other European countries experienced in the same period, was a sustained period of hardship that affected the daily lives of millions of Elizabeth's subjects in ways that the court culture of the same years did not entirely register. Menciand the Poetic Sigam. The most prominent of these later favourites was Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex. He was the stepson of the Queen's old love, Robert Dudley, having been raised in his stepfather's household after the death of his own father. He had come to court in 1584, when he was 18 and the Queen was 51. He was tall, handsome, charming, ambitious, and dangerously unstable. The Queen took an immediate interest in him. By the late 1580s, after Leicester's death in 1588, Essex had become the Queen's principal favourite in a manner that combined the political attachments of the older Leicester relationship with the more theatrical chivalric posturing that the late period of the reign cultivated. Essex, however, was not Leicester. Leicester had been a man of considerable political shrewdness, who had managed his relationship with the Queen for nearly 30 years through episodes of conflict and reconciliation. Essex was a man of romantic temperament who lacked Leicester's strategic patience. He pursued military adventures in the Netherlands and Cadiz with mixed success. He had served at the Siege of Sluys in 1587. He had taken part in the expedition to Cadiz in 1596, which had been one of the most successful English military actions of the war, and in which Essex's role had been genuinely distinguished. He had taken part in the islands voyage of 1597, an expedition to intercept the Spanish treasure fleet in the Azores, which had been considerably less successful and had produced the first serious quarrels between Essex and the Queen on questions of military strategy. He quarrelled with the Queen openly, on more than one occasion, in ways that no other courtier of his generation would have dared. The most famous of these incidents took place at a council meeting in 1598, when Essex turned his back on the Queen during a heated discussion. The Queen, in fury, struck him on the ear. Essex, in equal fury, reached for his sword. He was prevented from drawing it by the Lord Admiral, who was standing beside him. Essex stormed out of the council chamber and refused to attend court for several months. The reconciliation, when it came, was uneasy and incomplete. The relationship between the Queen and her last great favourite was by this point deteriorating in ways that neither of them seemed able to arrest. He demanded military commands that the Queen was reluctant to give him. He gathered around himself a faction of ambitious younger men who saw him as their channel to the Queen's favour, and who pressed his interests against the more cautious advice of Cecil's son, Robert Cecil, who had taken over his father's role as principal minister after the elder Cecil's retirement. The crisis of the Essex relationship came in 1599 and 1600. Essex had been given command of an expedition to suppress a rebellion in Ireland, led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, which had been the most serious military threat to English authority in Ireland for a generation. The expedition was a substantial commitment of English resources. The Queen had been reluctant to entrust it to Essex. Essex had insisted and had eventually been given the command. The campaign was a disaster. Essex failed to engage Tyrone decisively, made a private and politically suspect agreement with him, and then, in September 1599, abandoned his command without permission and returned to England to defend himself in person to the Queen. He arrived at Greenwich Palace on the 28th of September 1599. He burst into the Queen's bedchamber before she was fully dressed, with the dust of his journey still on his clothes. The Queen, who had a substantial capacity to manage public scenes, did so on this occasion. She received him kindly. She allowed him to retire to clean himself. She summoned him later in the day, by which time her composure had given way to anger. She placed him under house arrest. He was tried by a special commission and stripped of his offices. He was eventually released to a kind of supervised liberty, but his political career was effectively over. He could not, however, accept that it was over. In February 1601, he attempted what was in retrospect one of the most ill-conceived political actions of the entire Tudor period. He marched through the streets of London on the morning of the 8th of February with about 300 of his supporters, calling on the citizens to rise in his name against his enemies at court, principally Robert Cecil. The day before, he had commissioned a special performance of Shakespeare's Richard II at the Globe Theatre, a play depicting the deposition of a sitting monarch, which Essex's supporters apparently believed would inspire the citizens to action when news of his rising spread. The strategy did not work. The rising failed within hours. The citizens of London, who had no reason to support a personal feud at court, did not rise. Essex retreated to Essex House on the Strand, was besieged through the afternoon, and surrendered in the evening. He was tried for treason a week later. He was executed on the 25th of February 1601 on Tower Green, the same site where Anne Boleyn had been executed 65 years earlier. He was 35. The Queen, by all accounts, was deeply affected by his death. The relationship had been complicated, contradictory, and in its way one of the most genuine connections of her later life. He had been, in some respects, the son she had not had. She had ordered his death because the alternative was the destabilization of the careful structure she had built over 40 years. The personal cost, again, was real. The political necessity was undeniable. She was 67 and getting old, and she had ordered the execution of a man she had loved. Now, the death of Essex marked, in some respects, the end of the Queen's emotional engagement with her court. She continued to perform her duties. She continued to receive ambassadors and to hear council reports and to attend chapel. But the energy that had carried her through 43 years of public performance was visibly diminishing. The court of her last 2 years, while still elaborate in its ceremonial forms, was a court of mourning more than a court of celebration. The young men who had filled the masques and the entertainments of the 1590s were either dead, like Essex, or had been compromised by his fall. The older statesmen, who had served her since the early years, were almost all gone. She was, in her final years, increasingly alone among a generation that did not entirely know her, and that was already beginning, with discreet correspondence and careful preparation, to look towards her successor. The last years of her reign were quiet and slow. Cecil was dead since 1598. The new principal minister, his son Robert, was a different kind of man, more cautious, more administratively careful, less personally close to the Queen than his father had been. The court was by now full of younger men and women who had grown up entirely within her reign, and for whom she was already a kind of historical figure. The Queen herself, in her late 60s, was still active, still engaged in the daily work of government, still capable of the public performances that her position required. But the energy was clearly waning. The hours of audience were shorter. The progresses through the country were less frequent. The decisions increasingly were being managed by Robert Cecil and the council on her behalf, with her concurrence rather than her active direction. The death of the elder Cecil in August 1598 had been, for the Queen, the loss of the man who had been her closest political collaborator for 40 years. He had served her since the first hour of her reign. He had been, more than any other single person, the architect of the administrative state that had supported her authority. In his last illness, when he was dying at his house in the Strand, the Queen had visited him several times, sitting beside his bed and feeding him broth from a spoon, in scenes that contemporary witnesses described with both surprise and affection. She had not been a queen given to such gestures. She had made an exception for Cecil. The death, when it came, left her without the colleague who had known her for the longest, and who had understood, more than anyone else still living, how she had built the reign that they had built together. The grief, in her usual style, was kept private. The political consequences, however, were apparent. The reign, in its remaining years, would be conducted by men who had come to her late, and who had not shared the long apprenticeship of her early decades. Robert Cecil, the son who succeeded the father, was 35 at the time of his father's death. He had been trained for office by his father over many years, with the care that the elder Cecil had given to all of his projects. He was small in stature, with a curvature of the spine that the Queen sometimes referred to in her teasing nicknames for him as her pygmy or her little elf. But he was politically able, administratively skillful, and deeply loyal to the institution of the Crown. The Queen, who had not been close to him in the way she had been close to his father, came to rely on him in the late 1590s and early 1600s as the principal manager of her government. The transition was, in retrospect, one of the more successful generational handovers in Tudor administrative history. The country in the Queen's last years continued to be governed competently despite the Queen's diminishing personal engagement, because the machinery that the elder Cecil had built was being maintained and extended by a son who understood its workings as no one else did. She gave in November 1601 what came to be called the Golden Speech. She addressed an assembly of members of the House of Commons who had come to her at Whitehall to be received by the Queen on the question of monopolies, which had been a contentious issue. The monopolies controversy had been simmering for several years. The Crown had granted to various courtiers and merchants exclusive rights to deal in particular commodities. The grants had been, in their original conception, a way of rewarding service without direct payment from the Treasury. They had become, in their actual operation, a kind of taxation on ordinary commerce, with the monopoly holders charging higher prices than the market would have produced and dividing the additional revenue between themselves and their court patrons. The complaints had reached Parliament, where members had begun to debate the matter in language that became, by the autumn of 1601, openly critical of the Crown's grants. The Queen, recognising that the matter could not be allowed to continue without response, took a step that almost no other Tudor monarch would have taken. She conceded. She announced, before the parliamentary session ended, that she would revoke the most contentious monopolies and would refer the others to investigation. She invited the leaders of the Commons to attend her at Whitehall to hear her reply in person. The delegation, of about 140 members, came to her on the 30th of November. She spoke for some time, in language that has come down to us in several slightly differing accounts. She thanked them for their loyalty. She acknowledged the difficulties of her reign. She said that she had never been desirous of anything that should hurt the people. She said that to be a king and wear a crown was a thing more glorious to them that see it than it was pleasant to them that bear it. She said that she had been content to be a taper of true virgin wax, to waste herself and spend herself for her country's good. She concluded, in the line that has been most often quoted, "This I count the glory of my crown, that I have reigned with your loves." The phrasing was characteristic. The speech was her conscious summing up of the relationship with her people that had been the foundation of her authority for 40 years, whether the words were entirely her own composition or whether they had been polished by Robert Cecil or some other hand. The surviving accounts do not allow us to determine with certainty, but the sentiment was hers. She had reigned for 43 years by then on the consent of her people. The consent had not been unconditional. It had required, throughout her reign, careful management, repeated public performance, the continual adjustment of her policy to the limits of what her subjects would accept. The Golden Speech was, in its way, an acknowledgement of the long political negotiation that had been the actual content of her rule. The members of Parliament, who knelt to receive it, recognised what they were hearing. Several of them wept. The speech, when its text was printed and circulated in the months that followed, became the most widely read document of the entire reign. She was interested, throughout these last years, in the question of who would succeed her, although she would not name the successor publicly until very near the end. The most plausible candidate, by every measurement, was James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary Queen of Scots and a great-great-grandson of Henry VII. James was, by 1600, a Protestant. He was an experienced ruler, having held the Scottish throne since infancy. His succession would unite the crowns of England and Scotland under a single dynasty for the first time in history. The diplomatic preparations for his succession, conducted largely by Robert Cecil through a careful correspondence with the Scottish court, were begun several years before the Queen's death, and were carried forward without her formal authorization, but also without her objection. The Queen died at Richmond Palace in Surrey, in the early hours of the 24th of March 1603. The death itself was the culmination of a slow decline that had begun several weeks earlier. She had been refusing food. She had said little in her final days. She had been comforted at the end by the Archbishop of Canterbury and by her chaplains. She had given some final indications by gesture that she accepted James of Scotland as her successor. She had then lapsed into what her physicians described as a kind of stupor. She died, finally, between 2 and 3 in the morning, with her ladies around her. The accounts of the Queen's last weeks come to us principally from the diary of Sir Robert Carey, a courtier and later a peer, whose detailed record of those weeks is one of the most vivid documents of the entire Tudor period. Carey describes the Queen's refusal to eat, her refusal to lie down, her long silences, her occasional outbursts. He describes her sitting on the floor for 4 days and nights at one point, refusing all attempts to move her. He describes the gradual realization among the household that the Queen would not recover, and the careful preparations that were being made behind the scenes for the succession. The mood in the palace in those final weeks is described in the surviving accounts as oppressive. The Queen would not have music played, although in her younger years music had been one of her great pleasures. She would not have her ladies read to her. She would not allow the ordinary entertainments of the court to proceed. The household tiptoed around her. The councillors came and went, conferring among themselves in low voices. The diplomatic representatives in London, who knew that the great political transition of the age was now at hand, sent dispatches home with daily updates on the Queen's condition. The decision, in those last days, of who would succeed her was both formal and informal at the same time. Robert Cecil and the council had, for several years, been corresponding in secret with James of Scotland, ensuring that he would be ready to assume the throne when the Queen died. The Queen herself, who had refused throughout her reign to name a successor publicly, had nevertheless given various indications that James was acceptable to her. In her final days, when she was no longer able to speak clearly, she gave, in answer to questions about who should succeed her, certain gestures that her counsellors interpreted as confirming the arrangements they had already made. Whether her gestures were truly meant to indicate James, or whether they were simply the involuntary movements of a dying woman, the council took them as sufficient and proceeded. She was given the last rites by Archbishop Whitgift, who knelt beside her in her final hours, and led her, as far as her remaining consciousness permitted, in the prayers of a dying Christian. The Archbishop, who had been her loyal ecclesiastical servant for many years, and who had held the see of Canterbury since 1583, was one of the few men whom she had genuinely trusted in her final decade. His presence at her deathbed was, in some ways, the proper final tribute of the church she had settled to the Queen, who had settled it. She lapsed, in the final hours of the 23rd of March, into a state from which she would not return. Her ladies, who had been with her for the long days and nights of her decline, watched through the darkness. Her physicians sat in the outer chamber, their work effectively done. The councillors waited in the great chamber beyond. The candles burned low. The river outside the palace, which had carried her between her residences for 44 years, flowed past in the dark. She died, by the best surviving accounts, between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. The death was peaceful, in the medical sense. There was no final agony, no last conscious moment of decision or farewell. The breath, which had been growing shallower and more irregular through the night, simply stopped. The lady who was sitting closest to her was the first to recognize that she was gone. The others gathered. The physicians were called. The death was confirmed. The news was carried within minutes to the council chamber, where Robert Cecil and the senior councillors were waiting. The arrangements that had been prepared for weeks now went into action. A messenger, Sir Robert Carey himself, had a horse already saddled. He left Richmond before dawn, carrying with him the news of the Queen's death, and a token by which his message would be authenticated when he reached Edinburgh. He rode for 3 days through wretched March weather, stopping only to change horses, sleeping for short hours in roadside inns. He reached Edinburgh on the 26th of March and was admitted to King James's bedchamber at Holyrood within an hour of his arrival. He delivered the news. The Stuart age in England had begun. In London, meanwhile, the proclamation of James as king was made on the morning of the Queen's death, within hours of her dying. The transition had been so well prepared by Cecil and his colleagues that the city accepted the news with a calmness that almost no observer of 40 years earlier would have predicted. There was no rebellion, there were no riots, there was no civil war. The crown passed from the Tudor dynasty, which had begun at Bosworth in 1485, to the Stuart dynasty, which would govern England, with one significant interruption, until 1714. The transition was in itself one of the achievements of the Queen's reign, even though the Queen herself was no longer alive to register it. She was 69 years old. She had been Queen for 44 years, 4 months, and 7 days. The Tudor dynasty, which had been founded by her grandfather Henry VII at Bosworth in 1485, ended with her. She had been the last surviving member of her family. The throne passed, before the morning was out, to James of Scotland, who became James I of England, and who was riding south within days to claim his new kingdom. Her body was prepared for burial in the manner appropriate to a sovereign. The court physicians performed the embalming. The Queen's gentlewomen washed and dressed her body in the formal robes of state. She lay in state at Whitehall for several weeks while the funeral arrangements were prepared. The body was then carried in a great funeral procession to Westminster Abbey, where she was buried in the Henry VII chapel. The funeral procession itself, on the 28th of April 1603, was one of the great public spectacles of the Tudor century. Over 1,000 official mourners walked in the cortege, in the elaborate hierarchical order that Tudor protocol required. The coffin was drawn on a bier, covered with purple velvet, with a wax effigy of the Queen in her crown and robes lying on top of it. The crowds along the route were enormous. The contemporary accounts speak of an outpouring of public grief that surprised even those who had expected the death to be widely mourned. Men and women in the streets wept openly. The chronicler John Stow wrote that there was such a general sighing and groaning as the like hath not been seen or known in the memory of man. The city, which had grown up entirely under her reign, was confronting the loss of the only sovereign most of its inhabitants had ever known. The tomb that was eventually built for her by her successor placed her sarcophagus next to that of her sister Mary, the two of them lying together for eternity in a juxtaposition that the historical reality of their lives would not have predicted, but that the dynastic logic of their family required. The tomb was the work of the sculptor Maximilian Colt, working over several years on a commission from King James. The effigy of Elizabeth that lies on top of the sarcophagus shows her as she had been in her last years, but with the deliberate dignity of stone funerary monuments rather than with the realism of any specific moment. The Latin inscription on the tomb read, "Consorts in throne and grave, here we sleep. Elizabeth and Mary, sisters, in the hope of resurrection." The words, in their compressed historical irony, have continued to move visitors to the chapel for 4 centuries. She had outlived her time. The men who had served her at the start of her reign had been dead for decades. The Cecil who had served her in the 1590s was the son of the Cecil she had appointed at Hatfield in 1558. Most of the writers and the soldiers and the sailors of the Elizabethan moment had died before her. She had become, in the last years, a survivor of an earlier generation, presiding by sheer endurance over a country that had grown up entirely within her reign and that had no other experience of political authority. What she left behind was substantial. The Elizabethan religious settlement, established in 1559, held throughout her life and was inherited by James intact. The settlement would, over the following century, become simply the Church of England, the established church that has continued in modified form to the present day. The Elizabethan Navy, which had been built up in the years before the Armada, was the foundation of the maritime tradition that would shape England's role in the world for the next 3.5 centuries. The Elizabethan literary moment, of which Shakespeare was only the most prominent representative, produced a body of work that has continued to be read, performed, and studied wherever the English language has reached. The political settlement she handed to James was, on the whole, a peaceful one. The country was at peace with its principal continental rivals. The succession had been managed without civil war. The crown had been transferred to a new dynasty without disruption. The institutions of government, although they would face severe tests under James's son Charles in the next generation, were, in 1603, functional and broadly accepted. The personal cost of all this was hers alone. She had reigned as a single woman in a culture that had no precedent for such a thing. She had survived the personal losses of her early life, the executions of her mother and her cousins and her friends, the deaths of her brother and sister, the betrayals of trusted advisers, the loneliness of 44 years of single rule, the slow process of becoming a public icon at the cost of her own private existence. She had done all of this with a combination of intelligence, instinct, courage, and patience that almost no other ruler of her century had matched. The girl who had been declared illegitimate at the age of 2 had become, by her own death in 1603, the most successful English monarch since the Norman conquest. What does her story leave us with, looking back across the 4 centuries since her death? It leaves us, I think, with several things. It leaves us with the understanding that political success, in conditions as difficult as those she faced, depends on a particular combination of qualities that are not always celebrated in the more dramatic narratives of history. Patience, for one, the willingness to wait, to defer decisions, to allow situations to clarify themselves before committing irreversibly to a course of action. The Elizabeth who survived the Seymour interrogation at 15 and the Tower at 20 had learned, very young, that the wrong word in the wrong moment could destroy her, and the rest of her career was an extended demonstration of what that lesson had taught her. The famous slowness with which she made decisions, which her ministers so often complained of, was not a failure of decisiveness. It was a deliberate strategy, born of hard early experience, for managing a political environment in which premature commitment was the most common form of disaster. It leaves us with the understanding that the management of religious difference in a country deeply divided by religious conviction is one of the most difficult tasks a ruler can undertake, and that the solutions, when they work, are usually messy compromises that no one initially loves. The Elizabethan religious settlement was nobody's first choice. It was insufficiently Protestant for the Puritans. It was insufficiently Catholic for the recusants. It was a fudge, a compromise, a deliberately ambiguous arrangement that allowed people of differing convictions to live alongside one another by not insisting on the precise resolution of the underlying disagreements. It worked for the most part, for the rest of her reign and well beyond. The ruler who had imposed it, against the preferences of her more zealous advisers, had understood something about the management of human disagreement that her century did not always reward. It leaves us with the understanding that the relationship between a ruler and a people is not a simple one of authority and obedience, but a complex negotiation conducted through speeches and progresses and portraits and ceremonies, in which the ruler's persona is constructed deliberately, over decades, as a public performance distinct from the private person. The Virgin Queen of the late portraits was not Elizabeth Tudor as she was in her bedchamber at Richmond. She was an icon, a deliberately fashioned construct, designed to project authority across a country and an age that had no other reliable means of being told what its ruler was. The construction was a piece of work. It was tended carefully throughout her reign. It was in the end one of the great political achievements of her career. It leaves us with a particular sense of what loneliness can be in a position of supreme public responsibility. She had no peers. Her ministers, however close they became, were always her servants. Her favourites, however dear they were to her, could be, and several of them were, executed when their actions made their continued life politically impossible. Her closest friend, perhaps, was the elder Cecil, who served her for 40 years, but the friendship was always conducted within the formal framework of master and servant, and it could not, in the nature of the arrangement, be a friendship between equals. She had no husband. She had no children. She had no royal sibling left alive after 1558. She had, throughout the long reign, the company of her ladies-in-waiting, who served her affectionately and were affectionately served in return, but who were not, again, equals. The position she had occupied by the time of her death was a position that no human being can occupy without becoming, in some fundamental way, alone. She had borne that loneliness for a very long time, with a quiet stoicism that her contemporaries did not always recognize, and that her biographers have often understated, and it leaves us with the woman herself behind all of this, the girl who had grown up motherless, the teenager who had been threatened with execution, the young queen who had inherited an exhausted treasury and a country in religious turmoil, and who had held the whole structure together with a combination of luck and patience and skill for the next 4 decades. The old woman who had stood on her feet at Richmond, refusing to lie down in some final exercise of the will that had been the central instrument of her life. The historical record cannot reach her in her final hours in any direct way. We can stand, in imagination, at a respectful distance and acknowledge what she had done. She is, in her actual person, beyond our reach. She always was. The careful self-presentation that she had practiced since adolescence was designed to keep her interior life private, even from the people closest to her. And 400 years after her death, we are not going to retrieve what her own ministers could not retrieve. But the public Elizabeth, the queen who ruled and the woman who endured, is available to us through the documents and the speeches and the portraits and the long record of her decisions. And through her, we can come to understand a life that, against every expectation, became one of the most consequential in the history of the English-speaking world. She had not been supposed to rule. She had been the unwanted second daughter, the demoted bastard, the household embarrassment, the careful adolescent, the imprisoned suspect, the cautious princess waiting for her sister to die. She had become by stages the queen who held a country together for 44 years, the queen who saw off a Spanish invasion, the queen whose name an entire age has come to bear. The journey from one to the other was not a fairy tale. It was the long, careful work of an intelligent and patient and deeply wounded woman who had learned very early what political life actually required. It is worth pausing in the quiet of this evening on the simple fact of how unlikely her achievement was. The historical figures who become great rulers are often, in their lives before greatness, marked out by clear signs of their future. They are noticed, they are favoured, they are educated for command. They are, from an early age, treated as people whose ascendancy is anticipated. Elizabeth was none of these things. She was, for the first 25 years of her life, a person of diminishing political importance, whose existence was inconvenient to the various regimes that governed England in those years, who was at best tolerated and at worst actively suspected, and whose accession to the throne was prevented, until the last possible moment, only by the absence of any plausible alternative. She had not been groomed for power. She had been, in many respects, groomed for survival. She arrived at the throne with no political training apart from the lessons of her own difficult past, with no apprenticeship in the actual work of government, with no peers among rulers who could have guided her, and with very few people around her, in the autumn of 1558, who had any confidence in her capacity to do what she would, in the end, do. The achievement was, therefore, in its own way an answer to the question of what a person can become out of the materials available to her, when those materials are not promising and when the surrounding circumstances offer no obvious encouragement. The girl who had been declared illegitimate at 2 became, in the long unfolding of her years, one of the great rulers of the early modern world. The pattern of her self-construction, slow and deliberate, and continually adjusted in response to the circumstances she encountered, is one of the few honest models that the historical record offers of how a difficult life can be made into a consequential one. She is buried at Westminster, beside her sister, in the chapel her grandfather built. The tombs are visited every day by tourists who come to see them, and who often, having come for other reasons, find themselves moved by the small stone effigies of the 2 women who lie there, the sisters who shared a father, who shared a kingdom, who could not share a religion, who survived each other by the slimmest of political margins, who were finally laid down together by their successor in the shared symbolism of dynasty and faith. They lie, both of them, in the dark of the chapel, with the long inscription above them, in the hope of resurrection. The reign that began with her accession in November 1558 was, in the long historical perspective, a singular thing. It was not the reign of a great philosopher-king. It was not the reign of a religious visionary. It was not the reign of a military genius. It was the reign of a woman who knew what she could do and what she could not do, who chose her people carefully, who paid attention to detail, who waited when waiting was the right action, who acted when action could not be delayed, and who held her country together through 44 years of pressures that by every reasonable assessment ought to have torn it apart. It was, in the end, the reign of someone who did the work day after day for a very long time. That is, I think, what we are left with. The girl who was never supposed to rule did rule, and ruled well, and did so by the slow, patient accumulation of decisions and judgments and acts of self-control that in their cumulative effect amounted to one of the most successful political careers in English history. There is no grand secret to it. There is only the long discipline of attention applied across a lifetime by a woman who had learned, very young, that the alternative to discipline was destruction. She has been gone for over 4 centuries. The country she ruled has changed beyond any recognition she could have imagined. The institutions she handed to her successor have evolved into a constitutional monarchy that bears only the most distant resemblance to her own personal rule. The religion she settled has fragmented and reformed itself many times since her death. The empire that began in her reign has been built and unbuilt. The language she spoke has spread across the world and been transformed by every population that has adopted it. But she remains, in the long memory of the English-speaking world, a particular kind of figure. The queen who ruled alone. The queen who survived. The queen whose name has become, almost in spite of itself, a byword for endurance and for skill in the most difficult of public callings. The figure who will continue, for as long as anyone reads the history of these islands, to stand at the centre of the story she helped to shape. We have walked this evening through a life that began in disappointment at Greenwich Palace in 1533 and ended in the quiet dignity of Richmond in 1603. 70 years, 44 of them on the throne, a passage of time that contained, in its accumulated decisions and its accumulated griefs, a substantial portion of what we now think of as the foundational story of the English nation. The girl who was born into the wrong sex for her father's purposes became the woman whose century is named for her. The motherless child who waited at Hatfield in the long muted years after her mother's execution became the queen at whose feet the nation eventually knelt. The teenager who was interrogated by Tyrwhitt became the queen whose interrogations of foreign ambassadors were studied for decades by diplomats, trying to understand how to handle her. The prisoner who refused to walk through Traitor's Gate became the sovereign whose word was law in the same fortress for 44 years. The young woman who learned, in the difficult years of her adolescence, that visibility was dangerous, became the queen whose visibility was so carefully managed in portraits and progresses and speeches, that her image continues to circulate in the world 4 centuries after her death. And not Grick. There is something restful in the long view about a life that ended well after great difficulty. There is something restful about the knowledge that the danger has passed, that the long anxious waiting is over, that the questions that mattered to the participants have been settled by the slow movement of history. The queen who could not, in her own time, know whether her settlement would hold, whether her country would survive the Armada, whether her cousin would be successfully removed from the political equation, whether her favourites would be loyal, whether her death would be peaceful, can be known to us, in retrospect, as the ruler whose settlement did hold, whose country did survive, whose long reign did end in peaceful succession. The anxiety that defined her life is not our anxiety. The struggle that consumed her energy for 44 years is not our struggle. We can rest in the contemplation of her life in a way that she could rarely rest in the living of it. That is, perhaps, one of the gifts that history offers us in the quiet hours of an evening like this one. The lives that were lived in turbulence can be received by us in calm. The decisions that cost their makers years of agonized reflection can be considered by us at our leisure, knowing how they turned out. The people who could not, in their own present, see what we can see in their past, can be befriended by us across the centuries, in the contemplative space that history opens up. We owe them our attention. They have given us, in their own difficult lives, the conditions in which our easier lives have become possible. Thank you for spending this evening with me, walking through the long life of one woman across the difficult and remarkable years of her century. If something in this account stayed with you, if a particular moment surprised you or moved you, if you found yourself thinking about the slow work of patience and judgment that any difficult life requires, I would love to hear it in the comments. These journeys are made for you, and your reflections keep them alive. There is, in the silence after a long story, a particular quality of settledness that the storytelling itself produces. The figures who have walked through the narrative have, by its end, been laid to rest. The events that mattered to them have been completed. The questions that consumed them have been answered, in one way or another, by the resolution of their lives. We who have followed them through the unfolding of the account are released. At the end, from the suspense that carried us, we can let them go. We can return to our own quiet rooms, our own nightstands, our own small concerns, with the larger pattern of their lives now folded carefully into the longer pattern of our knowledge. The Queen, in her sarcophagus at Westminster, has rested for over 4 centuries. The chapel above her, with its fan vaulting and its stone tracery, has been visited by generations of mourners and visitors and historians and ordinary people who pass beside her tomb and move on, often without noticing the inscription, often without knowing whose effigy lies on top of the stone. The dust, in the dim light of the chapel, settles on the carved drapery and on the carefully sculpted hands. The marble has acquired, over 4 centuries, the patina of long quietness. The Queen who could rarely rest in life rests now, in the kind of complete and undisturbable quiet that is available only to the long departed. She has become, in the slow work of time, a presence rather than a person, a figure in the architecture of national memory rather than a living woman with private fears and private satisfactions. The transformation is perhaps the final achievement of her long career, the closing accomplishment of a life that had been lived throughout its years in the deliberate construction of a public self that would outlast the private one. Then there is another story coming, a different chapter of the past, a different way that ordinary and people have lived their lives inside the great frame of history. And I think, if you are here, you are exactly the kind of person who will want to know it. Good night.